Part 4. 1. The Karenins, husband and wife, went on living in the same house, met every day, but were completely estranged from each other. Alexey Alexandrovich made it a rule to see his wife every day, so as to give the servants no grounds for conjecture. But he avoided dining at home. Vronsky never visited Alexey Alexandrovich's house, but Anna saw him elsewhere and her husband knew it. The situation was painful for all three of them, and none of them would have been able to live even one day in that situation had they not expected that it would change and that it was only a temporary, grievous difficulty which would pass. Alexey Alexandrovich expected that this passion would pass, as all things pass, that everyone would forget about it and his name would remain undisgraced. Anna, upon whom the situation depended and for whom it was most painful of all, endured it because she not only expected but was firmly convinced that it would all resolve and clarify itself very soon. She decidedly did not know what would resolve this situation, but was firmly convinced that this something would now come very soon. Vronsky, involuntarily yielding to her, also expected something independent of himself which would clear up all the difficulties. In the middle of winter Vronsky spent a very dull week. He was attached to a foreign prince who came to Petersburg, and had to show him the sights of Petersburg. Vronsky himself was of impressive appearance. Besides that, he possessed the art of bearing himself with dignified respect and was accustomed to dealing with people of this sort. That was why he had been attached to the prince. But he found the duty very burdensome. The prince wished to miss nothing of which he might be asked at home whether he had seen it in Russia, and he himself wished to take advantage, as far as possible, of Russian pleasures. Vronsky's duty was to be his guide in the one and the other. In the morning they went around seeing the sights, in the evening they partook of national pleasures. The prince enjoyed a health remarkable even among princes. By means of gymnastics and good care of his body, he had attained to such strength that, despite the intemperance with which he gave himself up to pleasure, he was as fresh as a big, green, waxy Dutch cucumber. The prince traveled a great deal and found that one of the main advantages of the modern ease of communication was the accessibility of national pleasures. He had been to Spain, where he had given serenades and become close with a Spanish woman who played the mandolin. In Switzerland he had shot a gems. In England he had galloped over fences in a red tailcoat and shot 200 pheasant for a bet. In Turkey he had visited a harem, in India he had ridden an elephant, and now in Russia he wished to taste all the specifically Russian pleasures. Vronsky, who was, so to speak, his chief master of ceremonies, went to great lengths in organizing all the pleasures offered to the prince by various people. There were trotting races, and pancakes, and bear hunts, and troikas, and gypsies, and carousing with a Russian smashing of crockery. And the prince adopted the Russian spirit with extreme ease, smashed whole trays of crockery, sat gypsy girls on his knees and seemed to be asking, what else, or is this all that makes up the Russian spirit? In fact, of all Russian pleasures, the prince liked French actresses, a certain ballet dancer and champagne with a white seal best of all. Vronsky was accustomed to princes but, either because he himself had changed lately, or because he had been much too close to this prince, this week seemed terribly burdensome to him. During the whole week he kept feeling like a man attached to some dangerous lunatic, fearing the lunatic and at the same time, from his closeness to him, fearing for his own reason. Vronsky constantly felt the necessity of not relaxing his tone of official deference for a second, so as not to be insulted. The prince had a contemptuous manner of treating those very people who, to Vronsky's surprise, turned themselves inside out to supply him with Russian pleasures. His judgments of Russian women, whom he wished to study, more than once made Vronsky flush with indignation. But what made the prince especially burdensome was that Vronsky could not help seeing himself in him. And what he saw in that mirror was not flattering to his vanity. This was a very stupid, very self-confident, very healthy and very cleanly man, and nothing more. He was a gentleman, that was true, and Vronsky could not deny it. He was equable and unservile with his superiors, free and simple with his equals, and contemptuously good-natured with his inferiors. Vronsky was like that himself and considered it a great virtue, but with respect to the prince he was an inferior, and this contemptuously good-natured attitude made him indignant. Stupid ox! Am I really like that? He thought. Be that as it may, when he said goodbye to him on the 7th day, before the prince's departure for Moscow, and received his thanks. He was happy to be rid of this awkward situation and unpleasant mirror. He said goodbye to him at the station, on the way back from a bear hunt, where they had spent the whole night in a display of Russian bravado. 2. On returning home, Vronsky found a note from Anna. She wrote, "I am ill and unhappy. I cannot go out, but neither can I go on without seeing you. Come in the evening. At 7 o'clock Alexei Alexandrovich is going to a meeting and will be there till 10. After a moment's reflection about the strangeness of her summoning him directly to her home, despite her husband's demand that she not receive him, he decided to go. That winter Vronsky had been promoted to colonel, had left regimental quarters and was living alone. After lunch he immediately lay down on the sofa and in 5 minutes the memories of the outrageous scenes he had witnessed over the last few days became confused and joined with the thought of Anna and the music tracker who had played an important role in the bear hunt, and he fell asleep. He woke up in the dark, trembling with fear, and hastened to light a candle. What was that? What was that terrible thing I saw in my dream? Yes, the music tracker, I think, small, dirty, with a disheveled beard, was bending down and doing something, and he suddenly said some strange words in French. Yes, that's all there was to the dream, he said to himself. But why was it so horrible? He vividly recalled the peasant again and the incomprehensible French words the peasant had uttered, and horror sent a chill down his spine. What is this nonsense? Thought Vronsky, and he glanced at his watch. It was already 8:30. He rang for his servant, hurriedly got dressed and went out to the porch, forgetting the dream entirely and suffering only over being late. Driving up to the Karenins' porch, he glanced at his watch and saw that it was 10 minutes to 9. A tall, narrow carriage hitched to a pair of gray horses stood at the entrance. He recognized Anna's carriage. She's coming to me, thought Vronsky, and that would be better. I don't like going into this house. But never mind, I can't start hiding, he said to himself, and, with the manner habitual to him since childhood of one who has nothing to be ashamed of, Vronsky got out of the sleigh and went to the door. The door opened and the hall porter with a rug over his arm beckoned to the carriage. Vronsky, who was not in the habit of noticing details, nevertheless noticed the astonished expression with which the porter glanced at him. Just at the doorway he nearly ran into Alexei Alexandrovich. The gaslight fell directly on the bloodless, pinched face under the black hat and the white tie gleaming from inside the beaver coat. The immobile, dull eyes of Karenin fixed themselves on Vronsky's face. Vronsky bowed, and Alexei Alexandrovich, chewing his lips, raised his hand to his hat and passed by. Vronsky saw him get into the carriage without looking back, receive the rug and a pair of opera glasses, and disappear. Vronsky went into the front hall. His eyebrows frowned. His eyes gleamed with anger and pride. What a position, he thought. If he'd fight, if he'd stand up for his honor, I'd be able to act, to express my feelings. But this weakness or meanness, he puts me in the position of a deceiver, which is something I never wanted and do not want to be. Since the time of his talk with Anna in Vrd's garden, Vronsky's thinking had changed greatly. Involuntarily submitting to the weakness of Anna, who had given herself to him entirely and expected the deciding of her fate from him alone, submitting to everything beforehand, he had long ceased to think that this liaison might end, as he had thought earlier. His ambitious plans retreated into the background again, and, feeling that he had left the circle of activity in which everything was definite, he gave himself wholly to his feeling, and this feeling bound him to her more and more strongly. Still in the front hall, he heard her retreating footsteps. He realized that she had been waiting for him, listening, and had now returned to the drawing room. "No!" she cried, seeing him, and at the first sound of her voice, tears came to her eyes. "No, if it goes on like this, it will happen much sooner." "What is it, my love?" "What? I've been waiting, suffering, 1 hour, 2, no, I won't. I cannot quarrel with you." "Surely you couldn't help it." "No, I won't." She placed both hands on his shoulders and gazed at him for a long time with a deep, rapturous and at the same time searching look. She studied his face to make up for the time in which she had not seen him. As at every meeting, she was bringing together her imaginary idea of him, an incomparably better one, impossible in reality, with him as he was. 3. "You met him?" she asked, when they sat down by the table under the lamp. "That's your punishment for being late." "Yes, But how? Wasn't he supposed to be at the council? He went and came back and went somewhere again. But never mind that. Don't talk about it. Where have you been? With the prince all the time? She knew all the details of his life. He wanted to say that he had not slept all night and had fallen asleep, but, looking at her excited and happy face, he felt ashamed, and he said that he had had to go and give a report about the prince's departure. But it's over now? He's gone? Yes. Thank God. You wouldn't believe how unbearable it was for me. Why so? It's the usual life for all you young men, she said, frowning, and taking up her crochet, which was lying on the table. She began extricating the hook from it without looking at Vronsky. I gave up that life long ago, he said, surprised at the change of expression in her face and trying to penetrate its meaning. And I confess, he said, his smile revealing his close-set white teeth, looking at that life all this week, it was as if I were seeing myself in a mirror, and I didn't like it. She held her crochet in her hands, not crocheting but looking at him with strange, shining and unfriendly eyes. This morning Liza came to see me. They're not afraid to visit me yet, in spite of Countess Lydia Ivanovna, she put in. She told me about your Athenian night too. How vile. I was just going to say that, she interrupted him. Was it the Therese you knew before? I was going to say, how vile you men are. How can you not imagine to yourselves that a woman cannot forget that? She said, becoming increasingly angry and thereby betraying the cause of her vexation. Especially a woman who cannot know your life. What do I know? What did I know? She said. Only what you tell me. And how do I know whether what you've told me is true? Anna, that's insulting. Don't you believe me? Haven't I told you that I don't have a single thought that I wouldn't reveal to you? Yes, yes, she said, obviously trying to drive the jealous thoughts away. But if you knew how painful it is for me. I believe you. I do. So what were you saying? But he could not immediately recall what he was going to say. These fits of jealousy, which had come over her more and more often lately, horrified him and, no matter how he tried to conceal it, made him cooler towards her, though he knew that the cause of her jealousy was her love for him. How many times he had told himself that her love was happiness, and here she loved him as only a woman can for whom love outweighs all that is good in life, yet he was much further from happiness than when he had followed her from Moscow. Then he had considered himself unhappy, but happiness was ahead of him, while now he felt that the best happiness was already behind. She was not at all as he had seen her in the beginning. Both morally and physically she had changed for the worse. She had broadened out, and her face, when she spoke of the actress, was distorted by a spiteful expression. He looked at her as a man looks at a faded flower he has plucked, in which he can barely recognize the beauty that had made him pluck and destroy it. And, despite that, he felt that when his love was stronger, he might have torn that love from his heart, had he strongly wished to do so. But now, when it seemed to him, as it did at that moment, that he felt no love for her, he knew that his bond with her could not be broken. Well, what did you want to tell me about the prince? I've driven him away. I've driven the demon away, she added. The demon was their name for jealousy. Yes, what did you start to tell me about the prince? Why was it so burdensome for you? Ah, unbearable, he said, trying to catch the thread of his lost thought. He doesn't gain from closer acquaintance. If I were to define him, he's a superbly nourished animal, the sort that gets first prize at exhibitions, and nothing more, he said with a vexation that she found interesting. No, how can you? She objected. After all, he's seen a lot. He's educated, isn't he? It's quite a different education, their education. You can see he's been educated only so that he can have the right to despise education, as they despise everything except animal pleasures. But you all love those animal pleasures, she said. And again he noticed her gloomy eyes, which avoided him. Why do you defend him so? He said, smiling. I'm not defending him. It makes absolutely no difference to me, but I think that if you didn't like those pleasures yourself, you might have refused. But it gives you pleasure to look at Teresa in the costume of Eve. Again the devil, said Vronsky, taking the hand she had placed on the table and kissing it. Yes. But I can't bear it. You don't know how I suffered waiting for you. I don't think I'm jealous. I'm not jealous. I believe you when you're here with me, but when you're alone somewhere leading your life, which is incomprehensible to me. She drew back from him, finally extricated the hook from her crochet, and quickly, with the help of her index finger, began drawing stitches of white woolen yarn, shining in the lamplight, one after another, and quickly, nervously flicking her wrist and its embroidered cuff. "Well, what then? Where did you meet Alexey Alexandrovitch?" Her voice suddenly rang unnaturally. "We bumped into each other in the doorway." "And he bowed to you like this?" She pulled a long face and, half closing her eyes, quickly changed expression, folded her arms, and in her beautiful face Vronsky suddenly saw the very expression with which Alexey Alexandrovitch had bowed to him. He smiled, and she gaily laughed, that lovely deep laugh that was one of her main charms. "I decidedly do not understand him," said Vronsky. "If he had broken with you after your talk in the country, if he had challenged me to a duel, but this I do not understand. How can he bear such a situation? He suffers, it's obvious." She said with a laugh, "He's perfectly content. Why are we all tormented when everything could be so good?" "Only not him." "Don't I know him? The lie he's all steeped in? Is it possible, if he has any feeling, to live with me as he does? He doesn't understand or feel anything." "Can a man who has any feeling live in the same house with his criminal wife? Can he talk to her, call her my dear?" And again she involuntarily pictured him, Matra, my Anna. "He's not a man, not a human being, he's a puppet. Nobody else knows it, but I do. Oh, if I were in his place, I'd have killed a wife like me long ago. I'd have torn her to pieces. I wouldn't say to her, Matrana, he's not a man, he's an administrative machine. He doesn't understand that I'm your wife, that he's a stranger, that he's superfluous. Let's not talk." "You are not right, my love," said Vronsky, trying to calm her. "But never mind, let's not talk about him. Tell me, what have you been doing? What's wrong with you? What is this illness and what did the doctor say?" She looked at him with mocking delight. Apparently she had found other ridiculous and ugly sides in her husband and was waiting for the moment to come out with them. But he went on, "My guess is that it's not illness but your condition. When is it to be?" The mocking gleam in her eyes went out, but a different smile, of the knowledge of something he did not know and of a quiet sadness replaced her former expression. Soon. You said our situation is tormenting and we must resolve it. If you knew how painful it is for me, and what I would have given to be able to love you freely and boldly. I wouldn't be tormented and wouldn't torment you with my jealousy, and soon it will be so, but not the way we think." And at the thought of how it would be, she seemed so pitiful to herself that tears came to her eyes and she could not go on. She laid her hand, shining under the lamp with its rings and whiteness, on his sleeve. "It will not be the way we think. I didn't want to tell you that, but you made me. Soon everything will be resolved, we'll all be at peace and no longer tormented." "I don't understand," he said, understanding her. "You asked me when?" "Soon. And I won't survive it." "Don't interrupt me." And she began speaking hurriedly. "I know this and know it for certain. I will die, and I'm very glad that I will die and deliver myself and you." Tears flowed from her eyes. He bent to her hand and began to kiss it, trying to conceal his anxiety, which he knew had no grounds, but which he was unable to control. "There, that's better," she said, pressing his hand with a strong movement. "That is the one thing left to us." He recovered and raised his head. "What nonsense! What meaningless nonsense you're saying!" "No, it's true." What is true?" "That I will die. I had a dream." "A dream?" Vronsky repeated and instantly recalled the music in his dream. "Yes, a dream," she said. "I had this dream long ago. I dreamed that I ran into my bedroom, that I had to get something there, to find something out. You know how it happens in dreams," she said, her eyes wide with horror, "and there was something standing in the bedroom, in the corner." "Ah, what nonsense! How can you believe?" But she would not let herself be interrupted. What she was saying was much too important for her. "And this something turned, and I saw it was a muzhik with a disheveled beard, small and frightening. I wanted to run away, but he bent over a sack and rummaged in it with his hands." And she showed how he rummaged in the sack. There was horror in her face. And Vronsky, recalling his dream, felt the same horror filling his soul. He rummages and mutters in French, very quickly, and rolling the rs in his throat. "You know, il faut le battre le fer, le broyer, le pétrir, and you must beat the iron, pound it, knead it." I was so frightened that I wanted to wake up, and I woke up. But I woke up in a dream. And I wondered what it meant. And Kornai says to me, "You'll die in childbirth, dear, in childbirth. And I woke up. What nonsense, what nonsense. Vronsky was sane, aware himself that there was no conviction in his voice. But let's not talk. Ring the bell, I'll order tea to be served. Wait, now, it won't be long, But suddenly she stopped. The expression on her face changed instantly. Terror and anxiety suddenly gave way to an expression of quiet, serious and blissful attention. He could not understand the meaning of this change. She had felt the stirring of new life inside her. 4. After meeting Vronsky on his porch, Alexey Alexandrovich drove, as he had intended, to the Italian opera. He sat out 2 acts there and saw everyone he had to. On returning home, he studied the khodrak attentively and, observing that no military coat hung there, went to his rooms as usual. But, contrary to his habit, he did not go to bed but paced up and down his study till 3 o'clock in the morning. The feeling of wrath against his wife, who did not want to observe propriety and fulfill the only condition placed upon her, not to receive her lover at home, left him no peace. She had not fulfilled his request, and he must now carry out his threat, demand a divorce and take her son from her. He knew all the difficulties connected with this matter, but he had said that he would do it, and now he had to carry out his threat. Countess Lydia Ivanovna had hinted to him that this was the best way out of his situation, and lately the practice of divorce had brought the matter to such perfection that Alexey Alexandrovich saw a possibility of overcoming the formal difficulties. Besides, misfortunes never come singly, and the cases of the settlement of the racial minorities and the irrigation of the fields in Zersk province had brought down on Alexey Alexandrovich such troubles at work that he had been extremely vexed all the time recently. He did not sleep the entire night, and his wrath, increasing in a sort of enormous progression, by morning had reached the ultimate limits. He dressed hurriedly and, as if carrying a full cup of wrath and fearing to spill it, fearing to lose along with it the energy needed for a talk with his wife, went into her room as soon as he knew that she was up. Anna, who thought she knew her husband so well, was struck by his look when he came in. His brow was scowling, and his grim eyes stared straight ahead, avoiding hers. His lips were tightly and contemptuously compressed. In his stride, in his movements, in the sound of his voice there were such resolution and firmness as his wife had never seen in him before. He came into the room without greeting her, made straight for her writing desk and, taking the keys, opened the drawer. "What do you want?" she cried. "Your lover's letters," he said. "They're not here," she said, closing the drawer, but by that movement he understood that he had guessed right and, rudely pushing her hand away, he quickly snatched the portfolio in which he knew she kept her most important papers. She tried to tear it from him, but he pushed her away. 3. "Sit down. I must talk with you," he said, putting the portfolio under his arm and pressing it so tightly with his elbow that his shoulder rose up. Surprised and intimidated, she gazed at him silently. "I told you that I would not allow you to receive your lover at home. I had to see him, in order to—" She stopped, unable to invent anything. "I will not go into the details of why a woman needs to see her lover. I only," she said, flushing. His rudeness annoyed her and gave her courage. "Can't you feel how easy it is for you to insult me?" she said. "One can insult an honest man or an honest woman, but to tell a thief that he is a thief is merely la constatation d'un fait. This cruelty is a new feature. I did not know it was in you. You call it cruelty when a husband offers his wife freedom, giving her the honorable shelter of his name, only on condition that propriety is observed. Is that cruelty? It's worse than cruelty, it's baseness, if you really want to know." Anna cried out in a burst of anger and got up, intending to leave. "No," he shouted in his squeaky voice, which now rose a pitch higher than usual, and, seizing her arm so strongly with his big fingers that the establishing of a fact bracelet he pressed left red marks on it, he forced her to sit down. "Baseness? Since you want to use that word, it is baseness to abandon a husband and son for a lover and go on eating the husband's bread." She bowed her head. Not only did she not say what she had said the day before to her lover, that he was her husband and her husband was superfluous, but she did not even think it. She felt all the justice of his words and only said softly, "You cannot describe my position as any worse than I myself understand it to be." "But why are you saying all this? Why am I saying this? Why?" he went on just as wrathfully. "So that you know that since you have not carried out my wish with regard to observing propriety, I shall take measures to bring this situation to an end. It will end soon anyway, she said, and again, at the thought of her near and now desired death, tears came to her eyes. It will end sooner than you thought up with your lover. You must satisfy your animal passions, Alexey Alexandrovich. I will not say that it is not magnanimous, but it is not even respectable to hit someone who is down. Yes, you're only mindful of yourself, but the suffering of the man who is your husband does not interest you. You are indifferent to the destruction of his whole life, to the suffering he has experienced. Alexey Alexandrovich was speaking so quickly that he became confused and could not get the word out. He finally came out with experienced. She nearly laughed and at the same time felt ashamed that anything could make her laugh at such a moment. And for the first time, momentarily, she felt for him, put herself in his place and pitied him. But what could she say or do? She bowed her head and was silent. He, too, was silent for a while and then began to speak in a cold and less squeaky voice, emphasizing the arbitrarily chosen words, which had no particular importance. I've come to tell you, he said. She looked at him. No, I imagined it, she thought, remembering the look on his face when he stumbled over the word experiments. No, how can a man with those dull eyes, with that smug calm, feel anything? There's nothing I can change, she whispered. I've come to tell you that I am leaving for Moscow tomorrow and will not return to this house again, and you will be informed of my decision through my lawyer, to whom I shall entrust the matter of the divorce. My son will move to my sister's, Alexey Alexandrovich said, trying hard to recall what he had wanted to say about the son. You need Seryosha in order to hurt me, she said, looking at him from under her brows. You don't love him. Leave me, Seryosha. Yes, I've even lost my love for my son, because he is connected with my loathing for you. But all the same I will take him. Goodbye. And he turned to go, but this time she held him back. Alexey Alexandrovich, leave me, Seryosha, she whispered once again. I have nothing more to say. Leave me, Seryosha, till I will give birth soon. Leave him with me. Alexey Alexandrovich turned red and, tearing his hand from hers, silently left the room. 5. The waiting room of the famous Petersburg lawyer was full when Alexey Alexandrovich entered it. 3 ladies, an old one, a young one, and a merchant's wife, and 3 gentlemen, one a German banker with a signet ring on his finger, another a merchant with a beard, and the third an irate official in uniform with a decoration around his neck, had obviously been waiting for a long time already. 2 assistants were writing at their desks, their pens scratching. The writing implements, of which Alexey Alexandrovich was a connoisseur, were exceptionally good. Alexey Alexandrovich could not help noticing it. One of the assistants, without getting up, narrowed his eyes and addressed Alexey Alexandrovich gruffly. What would you like? I have business with the lawyer. The lawyer's occupied, the assistant said sternly, pointing with his pen at the waiting people, and went on writing. Could he not find time? Said Alexey Alexandrovich. He has no free time. He's always occupied. Kindly wait. Then I shall trouble you to give him my card, Alexey Alexandrovich said with dignity, seeing the necessity of abandoning his incognito. The assistant took the card and, evidently disapproving of its content, went through the door. Alexey Alexandrovich sympathized with open courts in principle, but he did not entirely sympathize with certain details of their application in our country, owing to higher official attitudes which were known to him, and he condemned them insofar as he could condemn anything ratified in the highest places. His whole life had been spent in administrative activity, and therefore, whenever he did not sympathize with anything, his lack of sympathy was softened by recognition of the inevitability of mistakes and the possibility of correcting them in each case. In the new court institutions he did not approve of the circumstances in which the legal profession had been placed. 4. But till now he had never dealt with lawyers and his disapproval had been merely theoretical, while now it was increased by the unpleasant impression he received in the lawyer's waiting room. He'll come at once, the assistant said, and indeed, 2 minutes later the long figure of an old jurist who had been consulting with the lawyer appeared in the doorway, along with the lawyer himself. The lawyer was a short, stocky, bald-headed man with a reddish-black beard, light and bushy eyebrows and a prominent forehead. He was dressed up like a bridegroom, from his tie and double watch chain to his patent leather boots. He had an intelligent, peasant-like face, but his outfit was foppish and in bad taste. "Kindly come in," said the lawyer, addressing Alexey Alexandrovich. And, gloomily allowing Karenin to pass, he closed the door. "If you please." He indicated an armchair by the paper-laden desk and himself sat down in the presiding seat, rubbing his small, stubby-fingered hands overgrown with white hairs and inclining his head to one side. But he had no sooner settled in this position than a moth flew over the desk. With a dexterity one would not have expected of him, the lawyer spread his arms, caught the moth, and resumed his former position. "Before I begin talking about my case," Alexey Alexandrovich said, his eyes following in surprise the lawyer's movement, "I must observe that the matter I have to discuss with you must remain secret." A barely noticeable smile parted the lawyer's drooping reddish mustaches. "I would not be a lawyer if I was unable to keep the secrets confided to me. But if you would like some assurance." Alexey Alexandrovich glanced at his face and saw that his gray, intelligent eyes were laughing and seemed to know everything already. "You know my name?" Alexey Alexandrovich continued. "I know you and your useful dash." He caught another moth dash activity, as every Russian does, the lawyer said with a bow. Alexey Alexandrovich drew a breath, gathering his courage. "But, once resolved," he now went on in his squeaky voice, without timidity, without faltering, and emphasizing certain words. "I have the misfortune," Alexey Alexandrovich began, "of being a deceived husband, and I wish to break relations with my wife legally, that is, to be divorced, but in such a way that my son does not stay with his mother." The lawyer's gray eyes tried not to laugh, but they leaped with irrepressible joy, and Alexey Alexandrovich could see that it was not only the joy of a man who was receiving a profitable commission. Here there was triumph and delight, there was a gleam that resembled the sinister gleam he had seen in his wife's eyes. "You desire my assistance in carrying through the divorce?" "Yes, precisely," said Alexey Alexandrovich, "but I must warn you that I risk abusing your attention. I have come only to ask your advice in a preliminary way. I desire the divorce, but I give importance to the forms in which it is possible. It is very likely that, if the forms do not fit my requirements, I will renounce a formal suit." "Oh, that is always so," said the lawyer, "and it is always in your power." The lawyer dropped his eyes to Alexey Alexandrovich's feet, sensing that his look of irrepressible joy might offend his client. He saw a moth flying just in front of his nose and his hand jumped, but he did not catch it, out of respect for Alexey Alexandrovich's position. "Although our statutes on this subject are known to me in general terms," Alexey Alexandrovich continued, "I would like to know the forms in which cases of this sort are most often carried through in practice." "You wish," replied the lawyer, not raising his eyes, and adopting, not without pleasure, the tone of his client's speech, "that I lay out for you the ways in which the fulfillment of your desire is possible." And, at an affirming nod of Alexey Alexandrovich's head, he continued, only giving a fleeting glance now and then at Alexey Alexandrovich's face, which was covered with red blotches. "Divorce, according to our laws," he said with a slight tinge of disapproval of our laws, "is possible, as you know, in the following cases." "Let them wait," he said to the assistant who had thrust himself in the door, but nevertheless got up, said a few words and sat down again. "In the following cases, physical defects in the spouses, or a 5-year absence without communication," he said, bending down his stubby, hair-covered fingers, "or adultery," he pronounced this word with visible pleasure. "The subdivisions are the following." He continued to bend down his fat fingers, though cases and subdivisions obviously could not be classified together: physical defects in husband or wife, and adultery of the husband or wife. As he had run out of fingers, he unbent them all and went on, "This is the theoretical view, but I suppose that you have done me the honor of appealing to me in order to find out about the practical application. And therefore, going by precedent, I must inform you that all cases of divorce come down to the following: there are no physical defects, I may take it, and no 5-year absence either?" Alexey Alexandrovich inclined his head affirmatively. "Come down to the following: adultery by one of the spouses and exposure of the guilty party by mutual agreement, or, lacking such agreement, by involuntary exposure." "I must say that the latter case rarely occurs in practice," the lawyer said, and, glancing fleetingly at Alexey Alexandrovich, fell silent, like a seller of pistols who, having described the advantages of each of two weapons, waits for his purchaser's choice. But Alexey Alexandrovich was silent, and therefore the lawyer went on, The most usual, simple and sensible thing, I consider, is adultery by mutual consent. I would not have allowed myself to put it that way if I were talking with an undeveloped man, said the lawyer, but I suppose we understand each other. Alexey Alexandrovich was so upset, however, that he did not understand at once the sensibleness of adultery by mutual consent, and his eyes expressed bewilderment, but the lawyer immediately came to his assistance. People cannot go on living together, there is a fact. And if they both agree in that, the details and formalities become a matter of indifference. And at the same time this is the simplest and surest method. Now Alexey Alexandrovich fully understood. But he had religious requirements that prevented him from accepting this measure. That is out of the question in the present case, he said. Only one case is possible, involuntary exposure, confirmed by letters which I have in my possession. At the mention of letters, the lawyer pursed his lips and produced a high-pitched sound of pity and contempt. Kindly consider, he began. Cases of this sort are decided, as you know, by the religious department. The relevant fathers are great lovers of the minutest details, he said with a smile that showed his sympathy with the Reverend Father's taste. Letters undoubtedly could give partial confirmation, but the evidence must be obtained directly, that is, by witnesses. And, in general, if you do me the honor of granting me your trust, you should leave to me the choice of measures to be employed. He who wants results must allow for the means. If so, Alexey Alexandrovich began, suddenly turning pale, but at that moment the lawyer got up and went to the door to speak with the assistant, who had interrupted again. Tell her we don't give discounts, he said, and went back to Alexey Alexandrovich. While returning to his place he inconspicuously caught another moth. Fine upholstery I'll have by summer, he thought, frowning. And so, you were kindly saying, he said. I shall inform you of my decision in writing, said Alexey Alexandrovich, getting up and taking hold of the desk. After standing silently for a while, he said, I may thus conclude from your words that the carrying through of a divorce is possible. I should also like you to inform me of your terms. Everything is possible, if you allow me complete freedom of action, the lawyer said without answering the question. When may I expect to hear from you? He asked, moving towards the door, his eyes and his patent leather boots shining. In a week. And kindly give me an answer as to whether you will agree to undertake in this case and on what terms. Very well, sir. The lawyer bowed deferentially, let his client out of the door and, left alone, gave himself up to his joyful feeling. He felt so merry that, contrary to his rules, he gave the bargaining lady a lower price and stopped catching moths, having decided finally that by next winter he would have to reupholster the furniture in velvet, as at Signan's. 6. Alexey Alexandrovich had won a brilliant victory at the meeting of the commission on August 17. But the consequences of that victory crippled him. The new commission for the investigation into all aspects of the life of the racial minorities was appointed and sent to the scene with extraordinary swiftness and energy, inspired by Alexey Alexandrovich. 3 months later a report was presented. The life of the minorities was investigated in its political, administrative, economic, ethnographic, material and religious aspects. All questions were furnished with excellent answers, and answers not open to doubt, since they were not the product of human thought, which is always subject to error, but were the products of institutional activity. The answers were all the result of official data, the reports of governors and bishops, based on the reports of regional superiors and vicars, based for their part on the reports of local officials and parish priests, and therefore all these answers were indubitable. All the questions, for instance, about why there were crop failures, why the populations clung to their beliefs, and so on, questions that would not and could not be resolved for centuries without the convenience of the institutional machine, now received a clear and indubitable resolution. The results were in favor of Alexey Alexandrovich's opinion. But when the reports of the commission were received, Stremov, feeling himself cut to the quick at the last meeting, employed a tactic that Alexey Alexandrovich did not expect. Drawing several other members with him, he suddenly went over to Alexey Alexandrovich's side, and not only hotly defended the carrying out of the measures suggested by Karenin, but offered additional measures, extreme ones, in the same spirit. These measures, intensified far beyond Alexey Alexandrovich's fundamental idea, were accepted, and then Stremov's tactic was revealed. These measures, carried to an extreme, suddenly proved to be so stupid that statesmen, and public opinion, and intelligent ladies and the newspapers all fell upon them at one and the same time, voicing their indignation both at the measures themselves and at their acknowledged father, Alexey Alexandrovich. Stremov then withdrew, pretending he had only been blindly following Karenin's plan and now was himself surprised and indignant at what had been done. This crippled Alexey Alexandrovich. But in spite of declining health, in spite of family woes, he did not give in. A split occurred in the commission. Some members, with Stremov at their head, justified their mistake by their trust in the inspection commission directed by Alexey Alexandrovich, which had presented the report, and said that the report of this commission was nonsense and nothing but waste paper. Alexey Alexandrovich, with a party of people who saw the danger of such a revolutionary attitude towards official papers, continued to support the data provided by the inspection commission. As a result, everything became confused in higher spheres and even in society, and, despite great interest on everyone's part, no one could make out whether the minorities were flourishing or were actually in need and perishing. Alexey Alexandrovich's position, as a result of that and partly as a result of the scorn that fell on him owing to his wife's infidelity, became quite shaky. And in that position Alexey Alexandrovich took an important decision. He announced, to the surprise of the commission, that he would request permission to go personally to investigate the matter on the spot. And, having received permission, Alexey Alexandrovich set out for the distant provinces. Alexey Alexandrovich's departure caused a great stir, the more so as at his departure he officially returned under receipt the traveling money allotted him for 12 horses to take him to his destination. "I find it very noble," Betsy said of it to Princess Myagki. "Why provide for post horses when everyone knows there are railways everywhere now?" But Princess Myagki disagreed, and Princess Tverskoy's opinion even vexed her. "It's all very well for you to talk," she said, "since you have I don't know how many millions, but I like it very much when my husband goes inspecting in the summer. It's very healthy and pleasant for him to ride around, and I make it a rule that the money goes for keeping a coach and coachman." On his way to the distant provinces Alexey Alexandrovich stopped for 3 days in Moscow. The day after his arrival he went to visit the Governor-General. At the intersection of Gazetny Lane, where there is always a crowd of carriages and cabs, Alexey Alexandrovich suddenly heard his name called out in such a loud and merry voice that he could not help turning round. On the corner pavement, in a short, fashionable coat, with his short, fashionable hat cocked to one side, the gleam of a white-toothed smile between his red lips, merry, young and beaming, stood Stepan Arkadyevitch, resolutely and insistently shouting and demanding that he stop. He was holding on with one hand to the window of a carriage that had stopped at the corner, out of which peered a woman's head in velvet hat and 2 children's heads, and was smiling and beckoning to his brother-in-law with the other hand. The lady smiled a kindly smile and also waved her hand to Alexey Alexandrovich. It was Dolly with the children. Alexey Alexandrovich did not want to see anyone in Moscow, least of all his wife's brother. He raised his hat and was about to drive on, but Stepan Arkadyevitch told his coachman to stop and ran to him across the snow. "How wicked of you not to send word. Have you been here long? And I was at the Dusach yesterday and saw Karenin on the board, and it never occurred to me that it was you," said Stepan Arkadyevitch, thrusting his head inside the carriage. "Otherwise I'd have called on you." "I'm so glad to see you," he said, knocking one foot against the other to shake off the snow. "How wicked of you not to let us know," he repeated. "I had no time, I'm very busy," Alexey Alexandrovich replied dryly. "Let's go to my wife, she wants so much to see you." Alexey Alexandrovich removed the rug in which his chill-prone legs were wrapped and, getting out of the carriage, made his way over the snow to Darya Alexandrovna. "What is it, Alexey Alexandrovich? Why do you avoid us like this?" Dolly said, smiling sadly. "I've been very busy." "Very glad to see you," he said, in a tone which showed clearly that he was upset by it. "How are you? And how is my dear Anna?" Alexey Alexandrovich mumbled something and was about to leave. But Stepan Arkadyevitch stopped him. "Here's what we'll do tomorrow, Dolly. Invite him for dinner. We'll invite Koznishev and Pestov and treat him to the Moscow intelligentsia." "Yes, please do come," said Dolly. "We'll expect you at 5, 6 if you like." "Well, how is my dear Anna?" "It's so long since." "She's well," Alexey Alexandrovich mumbled, frowning. "Very glad to see you." And he made for his carriage. "Will you come?" Dolly called out. Alexey Alexandrovich said something that Dolly could not make out in the noise of moving carriages. "I'll drop in tomorrow," Stepan Arkadyevich called to him. Alexey Alexandrovich got into his carriage and sank deep inside, so as not to see or be seen. "An odd bird," Stepan Arkadyevich said to his wife and, looking at his watch, made a gesture in front of his face signifying love for his wife and children, and went off jauntily down the pavement. "Stiva, Stiva," Dolly called out, blushing. He turned. "I have to buy coats for Grisha and Tanya. Give me some money." "Never mind. Tell them I'll pay," and he disappeared, nodding gaily to an acquaintance driving by. 7. The next day was Sunday. Stepan Arkadyevich called in on the ballet rehearsal at the Bolshoi Theater and gave Masha Shabasova, a pretty dancer, newly signed on through his patronage, the coral necklace he had promised her the day before and, backstage, in the theater's daytime darkness, managed to kiss her pretty face, brightened by the gift. Besides giving her the coral necklace, he had to arrange to meet her after the performance. Explaining to her that he could not be there for the beginning of the ballet, he promised to come by the last act and take her to supper. From the theater Stepan Arkadyevich went to the Okhotny market, personally selected the fish and asparagus for dinner, and by noon was already at the Dusat, where he had to see 3 people who, fortunately for him, were staying at the same hotel. Levine, who was staying there after recently returning from abroad, his newly appointed superior, who had just taken over that high position and was inspecting Moscow, and his brother-in-law Karenin, to bring him to dinner without fail. Stepan Arkadyevich loved dining, but still more he loved giving a dinner. Not a big dinner, but a refined one as to the food, the drinks and the selection of guests. The program for today's dinner was very much to his liking. There would be live perch, asparagus and la pièce de résistance, a superb but simple roast beef, and the appropriate wines. So much for the food and drink. And as guests there would be Kitty and Levine, and, to make it less conspicuous, another girl cousin and the young Strubytsky, and la pièce de résistance among the guests. Sergei Kazanchev and Alexey Alexandrovich, Muscovite philosopher and Petersburg politician. And he would also invite the well-known eccentric and enthusiast Pestov, a liberal, a talker, a musician, a historian, and the dearest 50-year-old boy, who would be like the gravy or garnish for Kazanchev and Karenin. He would rile them up and set them on each other. The second installment of the merchant's money for the wood had been received and was not yet all spent. Dolly had been very sweet and kind lately, and the thought of the dinner gladdened Stepan Arkadyevich in all respects. He was in the merriest state of mind. There were 2 slightly unpleasant circumstances, but they both drowned in the sea of good-natured merriment that surged in his soul. These 2 circumstances were, first, that yesterday, when he met Alexey Alexandrovich in the street, he noticed that he was dry and stern with him, and, putting together the look on Alexey Alexandrovich's face, plus the fact that he had not called on them and had not let them know he was there, with the talk he had heard about Anna and Vronsky, Stepan Arkadyevich guessed that something was wrong between the husband and wife. That was one unpleasantness. The other slight unpleasantness was that his new superior, like all new superiors, already had the reputation of being a terrible man, who got up at 6 o'clock in the morning, worked like a horse, and demanded that his subordinates work in the same way. Besides, this new superior was also reputed to have the manners of a bear and, according to rumor, was a man of the completely opposite tendency from that to which the former superior had adhered and to which, till then, Stepan Arkadyevich himself had also adhered. The day before, Stepan Arkadyevich had come to work in his uniform and the new superior had been very amiable and had got to talking with him as with an acquaintance. Therefore Stepan Arkadyevich felt obliged to call on him in a frock coat. 5. The thought that the new superior might not take it well was that second unpleasant circumstance. But Stepan Arkadyevich felt instinctively that it would all shape up beautifully. They're human, they're people, just like us sinners. Why get angry and quarrel? He thought, going into the hotel. "Greetings, Vasily," he said, walking down the corridor with his hat cocked and addressing a servant he knew. "So you're letting your side whiskers grow? Levin's in number 7, eh? Take me there, please, and find out whether Count Anikin, that was the new superior, will receive me." "Very well, sir," Vasily replied, smiling. "You haven't been here for a long time." "I was here yesterday, only I used a different entrance." "Is this number 7? Levin was standing in the middle of the room with a muzhik from Tver measuring a fresh bearskin with a yardstick when Stepan Arkadyevich came in. "Ah, you shot it?" Stepan Arkadyevich cried. "A fine thing. A she-bear?" "Hello, Arkhip." He shook hands with the muzhik and sat down on a chair without taking off his coat and hat. "But do take it off and stay a while," said Levin, taking his hat off him. "No, I have no time, I'll stay for one little second," Stepan Arkadyevich replied. He threw his coat open, but then took it off and sat for a whole hour talking with Levin about hunting and the most heartfelt subjects. "Well, kindly tell me, what did you do abroad?" "Where did you go?" said Stepan Arkadyevich, when the muzhik left. "I was in Germany, in Prussia, in France, in England, not in the capitals, but in the manufacturing towns, and saw many new things." "I'm glad I went." "Yes, I know your idea about setting up the workers." "Not at all. There can be no workers' problem in Russia." "In Russia there's a problem of the relation of working people to the land." "It exists there, too, but there it's the repairing of something damaged, while here." Stepan Arkadyevich listened attentively to Levin. "Yes, yes," he said. "It's very possible that you're right," he observed. "But I'm glad you're in cheerful spirits, hunting bear, and working, and getting enthusiastic." "Strabudsky told me he met you and that you were in some sort of despondency, kept talking about death." "And what of it?" "I haven't stopped thinking about death," said Levin. "It's true that it's time to die, and that everything is nonsense. I'll tell you truly, I value my thought and work terribly, but in essence, think about it, this whole world of ours is just a bit of mildew that grew over a tiny planet. And we think we can have something great, thoughts, deeds. They're all grains of sand." "But, my dear boy, that's as old as the hills." "Old, yes, but you know, once you understand it clearly, everything somehow becomes insignificant. Once you understand that you'll die today or tomorrow and there'll be nothing left, everything becomes so insignificant. I consider my thought very important, but it turns out to be as insignificant, even if it's carried out, as tracking down this she-bear." "So you spend your life diverted by hunting or work in order not to think about death." Stepan Arkadyevich smiled subtly and gently as he listened to Levin. "Well, naturally. Here you're coming over to my side. Remember, you attacked me for seeking pleasures in life. Be not so stern, O moralist." 6. "No, all the same there is this good in life that—" Levin became confused. "But I don't know. I only know that we'll die soon." "Why soon?" "And you know, there's less charm in life when you think about death, but it's more peaceful." "On the contrary, the last days are the merriest." "Well, anyhow, it's time for me to go," said Stepan Arkadyevich, getting up for the 10th time. "No, stay," said Levin, trying to keep him. "When are we going to see each other now?" "I'm leaving tomorrow." "I'm a fine one." "That's what I came for. You must come to dinner with us tonight. Your brother will be there, and my brother-in-law Karenin." "Is he here?" said Levin, and he wanted to ask about Kitty. He had heard that she had been in Petersburg at the beginning of winter, staying with her sister, the diplomat's wife, and did not know if she had come back or not, but he changed his mind about asking. "She'll be there or she won't be, it makes no difference." "So you'll come?" "Well, naturally." "At 5 o'clock, then, and in a frock coat." And Stepan Arkadyevich got up and went downstairs to see his new superior. Stepan Arkadyevich's instinct had not deceived him. The terrible new superior turned out to be a very courteous man, and Stepan Arkadyevich had lunch with him and stayed so long that it was past 3 o'clock before he got to Alexey Alexandrovich. 8. Alexey Alexandrovich, having come back from church, spent the whole morning at home. He was faced that morning with two tasks: first, to receive and send off to Petersburg a deputation from the racial minorities that was now in Moscow, and second, to write the promised letter to the lawyer. The deputation, though invited on his initiative, presented many inconveniences and even dangers. and Alexei Alexandrovich was very glad to have found it in Moscow. The members of the deputation had not the slightest idea of their role and responsibilities. They were naively convinced that their course consisted in explaining their needs and the true state of things and asking for government assistance, and they decidedly failed to understand that some of their statements and demands supported the hostile party and would therefore ruin the whole thing. Alexei Alexandrovich spent a long time with them, wrote a program from which they were not to deviate, and, after dismissing them, wrote letters to Petersburg for the guidance of the deputation. His chief assistant in this matter was to be Countess Lydia Ivanovna. She was an expert in dealing with deputations, and no one knew so well as she how to handle a deputation and guide it properly. Having finished that, Alexei Alexandrovich also wrote to the lawyer. Without the least hesitation, he gave him permission to act at his own discretion. In the letter he enclosed 3 notes from Vronsky to Anna which he had found in the portfolio he had taken from her. Ever since Alexei Alexandrovich had left home with the intention of not returning to his family, and ever since he had seen the lawyer and told at least one person of his intention, especially since he had turned the matter of his life into a matter of papers, he had been growing more and more accustomed to his intention and now saw clearly the possibility of carrying it through. He was sealing the envelope to his lawyer when he heard the loud sounds of Stepan Arkadyevitch's voice. Stepan Arkadyevitch was arguing with Alexei Alexandrovich's valet and insisting that he should be announced. It makes no difference, thought Alexei Alexandrovich. So much the better. I'll declare my position regarding his sister now and explain why I cannot dine with them. Show him in, he said loudly, gathering up the papers and putting them into the blotter. You see, you're lying. He is at home. Stepan Arkadyevitch's voice said to the lackey who had refused to let him in, and, taking his coat off as he went, Oblonsky entered the room. Well, I'm very glad I found you at home. So, I hope, Stepan Arkadyevitch began merrily. I cannot come, Alexei Alexandrovich said coldly, standing and not inviting his visitor to sit down. Alexei Alexandrovich meant to enter at once into the cold relations he ought to have with the brother of a wife with whom he was beginning divorce proceedings, but he had not taken into account the sea of good-naturedness that overflowed the shores of Stepan Arkadyevitch's soul. Stepan Arkadyevitch opened his shining, clear eyes wide. Why can't you? What do you mean to say? He said perplexedly in French. No. You promised. And we're all counting on you. I mean to say that I cannot come to your house, because the family relations that existed between us must cease. What? I mean, how? Why? Stepan Arkadyevitch said with a smile. Because I am starting divorce proceedings against your sister, my wife. I have been forced. But before Alexei Alexandrovich had time to finish what he was saying, Stepan Arkadyevitch acted in a way he had not expected at all. Stepan Arkadyevitch gasped and sank into an armchair. No, Alexei Alexandrovich, what are you saying? Cried Oblonsky, and suffering showed on his face. It's so. Forgive me, but I can't, I simply can't believe it. Alexei Alexandrovich sat down, feeling that his words had not had the effect he anticipated, that it would be necessary for him to explain himself, and that whatever his explanations might be, his relations with his brother-in-law would remain the same. Yes, I am put under the painful necessity of demanding a divorce, he said. I'll tell you one thing, Alexei Alexandrovich. I know you to be an excellent and just man. I know Anna, forgive me. I can't change my opinion of her, to be a wonderful, excellent woman, and therefore, forgive me, but I can't believe it. There's some misunderstanding here, he said. Yes, if only it were a misunderstanding. Excuse me, I do see, Stepan Arkadyevitch interrupted. But, naturally, one thing, you mustn't be hasty. You mustn't be hasty. I am not being hasty, Alexei Alexandrovich said coldly. And one cannot take anyone else's advice in such a matter. I am firmly decided. This is terrible, said Stepan Arkadyevitch with a deep sigh. There's one thing I'd do, Alexei Alexandrovich. I beg you to do it, he said. The proceedings haven't started yet, as I understand. Before you start them, go and see my wife, talk with her. She loves Anna like a sister, she loves you, and she is an amazing woman. For God's sake, talk with her. Do it out of friendship for me, I beg you. Alexei Alexandrovich reflected, and Stepan Arkadyevitch looked at him sympathetically, without breaking his silence. Will you go and see her? I don't know. That's why I didn't call on you. I suppose our relations must change. Why so? I don't see it. Permit me to think that, apart from our family relations, you have for me, at least somewhat, the friendly feelings that I have always had for you, and true respect," said Stepan Arkadyevitch, pressing his hand. "Even if your worst suppositions are right, I do not and never will take it upon myself to judge either side, and I see no reason why our relations must change. But do it now, come and see my wife." "Well, we have different views of this matter," Alexey Alexandrovitch said coldly. "However, let's not talk about it." "No, why shouldn't you come? Why not tonight for dinner? My wife is expecting you." "Please come, and above all, talk it over with her. She's an amazing woman. For God's sake, I beg you on my knees." "If you want it so much, I'll come," Alexey Alexandrovitch said with a sigh. And, wishing to change the subject, he asked about something that interested them both: Stepan Arkadyevitch's new superior, not yet an old man, who had suddenly been appointed to such a high position. Alexey Alexandrovitch had never liked Count Anikin even before and had always differed with him in opinion, but now he could not refrain from the hatred, comprehensible among officials, of a man who has suffered a fiasco in the service for a man who has received a promotion. "Well, have you seen him?" Alexey Alexandrovitch said with a venomous grin. "Of course, he came to our office yesterday. He seems to know his business perfectly and is very energetic." "Yes, but at what is his energy directed?" said Alexey Alexandrovitch. "At getting things done, or at redoing what has already been done. The misfortune of our government is paper administration, of which he is a worthy representative. I really don't know what he can be faulted for. I don't know his tendency, but one thing I do know, he's an excellent fellow," Stepan Arkadyevitch replied. "I've just called on him and, really, he's an excellent fellow. We had lunch, and I taught him to make that drink, you know, wine with oranges. It's very refreshing, and remarkably enough, he didn't know it. He liked it very much." "No, really, he's a nice fellow." Stepan Arkadyevitch looked at his watch. "Heavens, it's past 4 and I still have to see Dolgophushchin. So, please do come for dinner. Otherwise you don't know how upset my wife and I will be." Alexey Alexandrovitch saw his brother-in-law off quite differently from the way he had met him. "I've promised and I will come," he answered glumly. "Believe me, I appreciate it, and I hope you won't regret it," Stepan Arkadyevitch replied, smiling. And, putting on his coat as he left, he brushed the valet's head with his hand, laughed and went out. "At 5 o'clock, and in a frock coat, please," he called out once more, coming back to the door. 9. It was past 5 and some of the guests had already arrived when the host arrived himself. He came in together with Sergei Ivanovitch Koznishev and Pestov, who had bumped into each other on the doorstep. These were the two main representatives of the Moscow intelligentsia, as Oblonsky called them. They were both people respected for their character and intelligence. They respected each other but were in complete and hopeless disagreement on almost everything, not because they belonged to opposite tendencies, but precisely because they were from the same camp. Their enemies mixed them up, but within that camp each had his own shade. And since there is nothing less conducive to agreement than a difference of thinking in half-abstract things, they not only never agreed in their opinions, but had long grown used to chuckling at each other's incorrigible error without getting angry. They were going in the door, talking about the weather, when Stepan Arkadyevitch overtook them. Prince Alexander Dmitrievich, Oblonsky's father-in-law, young Strubytsky, Trovtsin, Kitty and Karenin were already sitting in the drawing room. Stepan Arkadyevitch saw at once that without him things were going badly in the drawing room. Darya Alexandrovna, in her smart grey silk dress, obviously preoccupied by the children's having to eat alone in the nursery and by her husband's absence, had not managed to mix this whole company without him. They all sat like a parson's daughters on a visit, in the old prince's expression, obviously perplexed at how they had wound up there, squeezing out words so as not to be silent. The good-natured Trovtsin obviously felt out of his element, and the thick-lipped smile with which he met Stepan Arkadyevitch said in all but words, "Well, brother, you've planted me among some clever ones. A drink at the Chateau des Fleurs is more in my line." The old prince sat silently, glancing sidelong at Karenin with his shining little eyes, and Stepan Arkadyevitch could see that he had already thought up a little phrase to paste on this statesman, whom one was invited for as if he were a poached sturgeon. Kitty was looking at the door, plucking up her courage so as not to blush when Konstantin Levin came in. Young Strubytsky, who had not been introduced to Karenin, was trying to show that this did not embarrass him in the least. Karenin himself, by old Petersburg habit, coming to dinner with ladies, was wearing a tailcoat and white tie, and Stepan Arkadyevich could see from his face that he had come only to keep his word and was performing a painful duty by being present in this company. He was the main cause of the chill that had frozen all the guests before Stepan Arkadyevich's arrival. On entering the drawing room, Stepan Arkadyevich excused himself by explaining that he had been delayed by that prince who was the perennial scapegoat each time he was late or absent, and in a moment he got everyone acquainted with everyone else, and, putting Alexei Alexandrovich together with Sergei Koznishev, slipped them the topic of the Russification of Poland, 7, which they both seized upon at once, along with Bestov. Patting Trovtsin on the shoulder, he whispered something funny to him and sat him down with his wife and the prince. Then he told Kitty how beautiful she was that evening, and introduced Strubytsky to Karenin. In a moment he had needed this social dose so well that the drawing room was in fine form and ringing with voices. Only Konstantin Levin was missing, but that was for the better, because, going out to the dining room, Stepan Arkadyevich saw to his horror that the port and sherry had been bought at Des Prezes and not at Levitz, and gave orders for the coachman to be sent to Levitz as soon as possible. Then he turned to go back to the drawing room. In the dining room he met Konstantin Levin. "I'm not late, as if you could be anything else," Stepan Arkadyevich said, taking him under the arm. "You have a lot of people." "Who's here?" Levin asked, blushing, as he knocked the snow off his hat with his glove. "All our own." "Kitty's here." "Let's go, I'll introduce you to Karenin." Despite his liberalism, Stepan Arkadyevich knew that acquaintance with Karenin could not but be flattering and therefore treated his best friends to it. But just then Konstantin Levin was unable to feel all the pleasure of this acquaintance. He had not seen Kitty since that evening, so memorable for him, on which he had met Vronsky, unless he were to count the moment when he had seen her on the high road. In the depths of his soul he had known that he would see her here tonight. But, maintaining his inner freedom of thought, he tried to assure himself that he had not known it. Yet now, when he heard that she was there, he suddenly felt such joy, and at the same time such fear, that his breath was taken away and he could not bring out what he wanted to say. "How is she?" "How?" "The way she was before, or the way she was in the carriage?" "And what if what Darya Alexandrovna said is true?" "Why shouldn't it be true?" he thought. "Ah, do please introduce me to Karenin," he barely uttered. And with a desperately determined step he went into the drawing room and saw her. She was neither the way she had been before, nor the way she had been in the carriage. She was quite different. She was frightened, timid, shamefaced, and all the more lovely because of it. She saw him the instant he came into the room. She had been waiting for him. She was joyful and so embarrassed by her joy that there was a moment, as he went up to the hostess and glanced at her again when it seemed to her, and to him, and to Dolly, who saw it all, that she would not be able to stand it and would start to cry. She blushed, paled, blushed again and froze, her lips quivering a little, waiting for him. He came up to her, bowed and silently gave her his hand. Had it not been for the slight trembling of her lips and the moisture that came to her eyes, giving them an added brilliance, her smile would have been almost calm as she said, "It's so long since we've seen each other," and with desperate resolution pressed his hand with her cold hand. "You haven't seen me, but I saw you," said Levin, radiant with a smile of happiness. "I saw you when you were driving to Yergushovo from the station." "When?" she asked with surprise. "You were going to Yergushovo," said Levin, feeling himself choking with the happiness that flooded his soul. And he thought to himself, how could I connect this touching being with the thought of anything not innocent? And, yes, it seems that what Darya Alexandrovna said is true. Stepan Arkadyevich took him by the arm and brought him to Karenin. "Allow me to introduce you." He gave their names. "Very pleased to meet you again," Alexei Alexandrovich said coldly, shaking Levin's hand. "You are acquainted?" Stepan Arkadyevich asked in surprise. "We spent 3 hours together on the train," Levin said, smiling, but came away intrigued, as from a masked ball. "Or at least I did." "Really?" "This way, please," Stepan Arkadyevich said, pointing in the direction of the dining room. The men went to the dining room and approached the table of hors d'oeuvres, set with 6 kinds of vodka and as many kinds of cheese with silver spreaders or without, with caviars, herring, various tinned delicacies and platters of sliced French bread. The men stood by the fragrant vodkas and hors d'oeuvres, and the conversation between Kosnichev, Karenin and Pestov about the Russification of Poland began to die down in anticipation of dinner. Sergei Ivanovich, who knew like no one else how to add some added salt, ate to the end of a most abstract and serious discussion and thereby change the mood of his interlocutors, did so now. Alexei Alexandrovich maintained that the Russification of Poland could be accomplished only as a result of higher principles, which ought to be introduced by the Russian administration. Pestov insisted that one nation could assimilate another only if it had a denser population. Kosnichev acknowledged the one and the other, but with limitations. To conclude the conversation, he said with a smile as they were leaving the drawing room, "Therefore there is only one way of Russifying the racial minorities, by breeding as many children as possible. There's where my brother and I are at our worst. And you married gentlemen, especially you, Stepan Arkadyevich, are quite patriotic. How many do you have?" He turned with a gentle smile to his host and held out his tiny glass to him. Everybody laughed, Stepan Arkadyevich with particular gaiety. "Yes, that's the best way," he said, chewing some cheese and pouring some special sort of vodka into the held-out glass. The conversation indeed ceased on that joke. "This cheese isn't bad. Would you care for some?" said the host. "So you've gone back to doing exercises?" He turned to Levin, feeling his muscle with his left hand. Levin smiled, flexed his arm, and under Stepan Arkadyevich's fingers a steely bump rose like a round cheese under the thin cloth of the frock coat. "What a biceps, Samson!" "I suppose it takes great strength to hunt bear," said Alexei Alexandrovich, who had very foggy notions of hunting, spreading some cheese and tearing through the gossamer thin slice of bread. Levin smiled. "None at all. On the contrary, a child can kill a bear," he said with a slight bow, stepping aside before the ladies who, together with the hostess, were approaching the table of hors d'oeuvres. "And you killed a bear, I'm told," said Kitty, trying in vain to spear a disobedient, slippery mushroom with her fork and shaking the lace through which her arm showed white. "Do you really have bears there?" she added, half turning her lovely head towards him and smiling. It seemed there was nothing extraordinary in what she said, yet for him, what meaning, inexpressible in words, there was in every sound, and every movement of her lips, eyes, arm, as she said it. Here was a plea for forgiveness, and trust in him, and a caress. A tender, timid caress, and a promise, and hope, and love for him, in which he could not but believe and which choked him with happiness. "No, we went to Tver province. On my way back I met your beau-frère on the train, or your beau-frère's brother-in-law," he said with a smile. It was a funny encounter. Brother-in-law. And he told, gaily and amusingly, how, after not sleeping all night, he had burst into Alexei Alexandrovich's compartment in his sheepskin jacket. "The conductor, contrary to the proverb, judged me by my clothes and wanted to throw me out. But at that point I began talking in high-flown language, and, you, too," he said, forgetting Karenin's name as he turned to him, "wanted to chase me out at first, judging by my jacket, but then stood up for me, for which I'm very grateful." "In general, passengers' rights in the choice of seats are rather vague," said Alexei Alexandrovich, wiping the tips of his fingers with a handkerchief. "I could see you were uncertain about me," Levin said, smiling good-naturedly, "but I hastened to start an intelligent conversation, so as to smooth over my sheepskin jacket." Sergei Ivanovich, continuing his conversation with the hostess while listening with one ear to his brother, cast a sidelong glance at him. "What's got into him tonight? Such a triumphant look," he thought. He did not know that Levin felt he had grown wings. Levin knew that she was listening to his words and liked listening to them. And that was the only thing that mattered to him. Not just in that room, but in all the world, there existed for him only he, who had acquired enormous significance, and she. He felt himself on a height that made his head spin, and somewhere below, far away, were all these kind, nice Karenins, Oblonsks, and the rest of the world. Quite inconspicuously, without looking at them, but just like that, as if there were nowhere else to seat them, Stepan Arkadyevich placed Levin and Kitty next to each other. "Well, why don't you sit here?" he said to Levin. The dinner was as good as the dinnerware, of which Stepan Arkadyevich was a great fancier. The soup Marie-Louise succeeded splendidly, The piroshki, which melted in the mouth, were irreproachable. The two servants and Matvei, in white ties, went about their duties with the food and wine quite unobtrusively, quietly and efficiently. On the material side, the dinner was a success. It was no less of a success on the non-material side. The conversation, now general, now particular, never lapsed and became so lively by the end of dinner that the men got up from the table still talking, and even Alexey Alexandrovich grew animated. 10. Pestov liked to argue to the end and was not satisfied with Sergei Ivanovitch's words, the less so as he sensed the incorrectness of his own opinion. "I never meant population density alone," he said over the soup, addressing Alexey Alexandrovich, "but as combined with fundamentals, and not with principles." "It seems to me," Alexey Alexandrovich replied unhurriedly and listlessly, "that they are one and the same thing. In my opinion, only that nation which is more highly developed can influence another, but that's just the question," Pestov interrupted in his bass voice, always in a hurry to speak and always seeming to put his whole soul into what he said. "What is this higher development supposed to be? The English, the French, the Germans, which of them stands on a higher level of development? Which will nationalize the other? We see the Rhine Frenchified, yet the Germans are not on a lower level," he cried. "There's a different law here." "It seems to me that the influence always comes from the side of true education," Alexey Alexandrovich said, raising his eyebrows slightly. "But what should we take as signs of true education?" Pestov said. "I suppose that these signs are known," said Alexey Alexandrovich. "Are they fully known?" Sergei Ivanovich put in with a subtle smile. "It is now recognized that a true education can only be a purely classical one, yet we see bitter disputes, 9, on one side and the other, and it cannot be denied that the opposing camp has strong arguments in its favor." "You are a classicist, Sergei Ivanovich." "May I pour you some red?" said Stepan Arkadyevich. "I am not expressing my opinion about either sort of education," Sergei Ivanovich said with a smile of condescension, as if to a child, and held out his glass. "I am merely saying that there are strong arguments on both sides," he went on, turning to Alexey Alexandrovich. "I received a classical education, but personally I can find no place for myself in this dispute. I see no clear arguments for preferring classical studies over the modern. The natural sciences have as much pedagogical and developmental influence," Pestov picked up. "Take astronomy alone, take botany or zoology, with its system of general laws." "I cannot fully agree with that," Alexey Alexandrovich replied. "It seems to me that one cannot but acknowledge the fact that the very process of studying the forms of languages has a particularly beneficial effect upon spiritual development. Besides, it cannot be denied that the influence of classical writers is moral in the highest degree, whereas the teaching of the natural sciences is unfortunately combined with those harmful and false teachings that constitute the bane of our time." Sergei Ivanovich was about to say something, but Pestov with his dense bass interrupted him. He heatedly began proving the incorrectness of this opinion. Sergei Ivanovich calmly waited his turn, obviously ready with a triumphant retort. "Yet," said Sergei Ivanovich, turning to Karenin with a subtle smile, "one cannot but agree that it is difficult to weigh fully all the advantages and disadvantages of both branches of learning, and the question of preference would not have been resolved so quickly and definitively if there had not been on the side of classical education that advantage you just mentioned, its moral or anti-nihilistic 10, influence. Undoubtedly, if there had not been this advantage of an anti-nihilistic influence on the side of classical learning, we would have thought more, weighed the arguments on both sides," Sergei Ivanovich went on with a subtle smile, "and left room for the one tendency and the other. But now we know that the pills of classical education contain the healing power of anti-nihilism, and we boldly offer them to our patients. And what if there is no healing power?" he concluded, sprinkling his Attic salt. Everybody laughed at Sergei Ivanovitch's pills, Trotzin especially loudly and gaily, having at last been granted that something funny which was all he was waiting for as he listened to the conversation. Stepan Arkadyevich had made no mistake in inviting Pestov. With Pestov intelligent conversation could not die down even for a moment. No sooner had Sergei Ivanovich ended the conversation with a joke than Pestov started up a new one. "One cannot even agree," he said, that the government has such a goal. The government is obviously guided by general considerations and remains indifferent to the influences its measures may have. For instance, the question of women's education ought to be regarded as pernicious, yet the government opens courses and universities for women. Let us say the word. And the conversation at once jumped over to the new subject of women's education. 11. Alexei Alexandrovich expressed the thought that women's education was usually confused with the question of women's emancipation and could be considered pernicious only on that account. I would suppose, on the contrary, that these two questions are inseparably connected, said Pestov. It's a vicious circle. Women are deprived of rights because of their lack of education, and their lack of education comes from having no rights. We mustn't forget that the subjection of women is so great and so old that we often refuse to comprehend the abyss that separates them from us, he said. You said rights, said Sergei Ivanovich, who had been waiting for Pestov to stop talking, meaning the rights to take on the jobs of jurors, counselors, the rights of board directors, the rights of civil servants, members of parliament. Undoubtedly. But if women can, as a rare exception, occupy these positions, it seems to me that you have used the term rights incorrectly. It would be more correct to say obligations. Everyone will agree that in doing the job of a juror, a counselor, a telegraph clerk, we feel that we are fulfilling an obligation. And therefore it would be more correct to say that women are seeking obligations, and quite legitimately. And one can only sympathize with this desire of theirs to help in men's common task. Perfectly true, Alexei Alexandrovich agreed. The question, I suppose, consists only in whether they are capable of such obligations. They'll most likely be very capable, Stepan Arkadyevich put in, once education spreads among them. We can see that. Remember the proverb, said the old prince, who had long been listening to the conversation, his mocking little eyes twinkling. I can say it in front of my daughters, long hair, short. 12. Exactly the same was thought of the Negroes before the emancipation. Pestov said angrily. I merely find it strange that women should seek new obligations, said Sergei Ivanovich, while unfortunately, as we see, men usually avoid them. Obligations are coupled with rights, power, money, honors. That's what women are seeking, said Pestov. The same as if I should seek the right to be a wet nurse and get offended that women are paid for it while I'm refused, the old prince said. Trotsky burst into loud laughter, and Sergei Ivanovich was sorry he had not said it himself. Even Alexei Alexandrovich smiled. Yes, but a man can't nurse, said Pestov, while a woman, no. There was an Englishman who nursed his baby on a ship, said the old prince, allowing himself this liberty in a conversation before his daughters. There will be as many women officials as there are such Englishmen, Sergei Ivanovich said this time. Yes, but what will a girl do if she has no family? Stepan Arkadyevich interceded, remembering Shabasova, whom he had had in mind all the while he was sympathizing with Pestov and supporting him. If you look into the girl's story properly, you'll find that she left her own family, or her sister's, where she could have had a woman's work, Darya Alexandrovna said irritably, unexpectedly entering the conversation, probably guessing what girl Stepan Arkadyevich had in mind. But we stand for a principle, an ideal. Pestov objected in a sonorous space. Women want the right to be independent, educated. They are cramped and oppressed by their awareness that it is impossible. And I'm cramped and oppressed that I can't get hired as a wet nurse in an orphanage, the old prince said again, to the great joy of Trotsky, who laughed so much that he dropped the thick end of his asparagus into the sauce. 11. Everybody took part in the general conversation except Kitty and Levin. At first, when the subject was the influence of one nation on another, Levin involuntarily began to consider what he had to say about it. But these thoughts, very important for him once, flashed through his head as in a dream and now had not the slightest interest for him. It even seemed strange to him that they should try so hard to talk about something that was of no use to anyone. In the same way, it would seem that what they were saying about the rights and education of women ought to have interested Kitty. How often she had thought of it, remembering Varenka, her friend abroad, and her painful dependence. How often she had wondered what would happen to her if she did not get married, and how many times she had argued about it with her sister. But now it did not interest her in the least. She and Levin were carrying on their own conversation, or not a conversation but some mysterious communication that bound them more closely together with every minute and produced in both of them a feeling of joyful fear before the unknown into which they were entering. First, in response to Kitty's question of how he could have seen her in a carriage last year, Levin told her how he had met her on the high road as he was walking home from the mowing. It was very early in the morning. You must have just woken up. Your maman was asleep in her corner. It was a wonderful morning. I was walking along and thinking, who is that in the coach and four? A fine four with little bells, and for an instant you flashed by, and I saw in the window, you were sitting like this, holding the ribbons of your bonnet with both hands and thinking terribly hard about something, he said, smiling. How I longed to know what you were thinking about. Was it something important? Wasn't I all disheveled? She thought. But seeing the rapturous smile that the recollection of these details evoked in him, she felt that, on the contrary, the impression she had made had been very good. She blushed and laughed joyfully. I really don't remember. How nicely Trovtsin laughs, said Levin, admiring his moist eyes and shaking body. Have you known him long? Asked Kitty. Who doesn't know him? And I see you think he's a bad man. Not bad, but worthless. That's not true. And you must immediately stop thinking so, said Kitty. I had a very low opinion of him, too, but he is the dearest man, and remarkably kind. He has a heart of gold. How could you know about his heart? He and I are great friends. I know him very well. Last winter, soon after you visited us, she said with a guilty and at the same time trustful smile, Dolly's children all got scarlet fever, and he came to see her once. And can you imagine, she said in a whisper, he felt so sorry for her that he stayed and began to help her look after the children. Yes, and he lived in their house for 3 weeks and looked after the children like a nurse. I'm telling Konstantin Dmitrich about Trovtsin during the scarlet fever, she said, leaning over to her sister. Yes, remarkable, charming, said Dolly, glancing at Trovtsin, who sensed that he was being talked about, and smiling meekly at him. Levin glanced at him once more and was surprised that he had not understood all the charm of this man before. I'm sorry, and I'll never think badly of people again, he said gaily, sincerely expressing what he then felt. 12. In the conversation begun about the rights of women there were questions about the inequality of rights in marriage that it was ticklish to discuss in front of ladies. During dinner Pestov had taken a fling at these questions several times, but Sergei Ivanovich and Stepan Arkadyevich had carefully deflected him. However, when they got up from the table and the ladies left, Pestov did not follow them, but turned to Alexey Alexandrovich and began to explain the main cause of the inequality. The inequality of spouses, in his opinion, consisted in the fact that the unfaithfulness of a wife and the unfaithfulness of a husband were punished unequally by the law and public opinion. Stepan Arkadyevich hastened to Alexey Alexandrovich and offered him a cigar. No, I don't smoke, Alexey Alexandrovich replied calmly and, as if deliberately wishing to show that he was not afraid of the conversation, turned to Pestov with a cold smile. I suppose the grounds for such a view are in the very essence of things, he said and was about to go to the drawing room, but here Trovtsin suddenly spoke unexpectedly, addressing Alexey Alexandrovich. And have you heard about Pryaknikov? Trovtsin said, animated by the champagne he had drunk and having long waited for a chance to break the silence that oppressed him. Vasy Pryaknikov, he said with a kindly smile of his moist and ruddy lips, mainly addressing the chief guest, Alexey Alexandrovich. I've just been told he fought a duel with Kvidsky and Vier and killed him. As one always seems to bump, as if on purpose, precisely on a sore spot, so now Stepan Arkadyevich felt that, unluckily, the evening's conversation kept hitting Alexey Alexandrovich on his sore spot. He again wanted to shield his brother-in-law, but Alexey Alexandrovich himself asked with curiosity, what did Pryaknikov fight the duel over? His wife acted like a real man, challenged him and killed him. Ah! Alexey Alexandrovich said indifferently and, raising his eyebrows, proceeded to the drawing room. I'm so glad you came, Dolly said to him with a frightened smile, meeting him in the anteroom. I must talk with you. Let's sit down here. With the same indifferent expression, produced by his raised eyebrows, Alexey Alexandrovich sat down beside Darya Alexandrovna and smiled falsely. The more so, he said, as I, too, wanted to beg your pardon and bow out at once. I must leave tomorrow. Darya Alexandrovna was firmly convinced of Anna's innocence, and she felt herself growing pale and her lips trembling with wrath at this cold, unfeeling man who so calmly intended to ruin her innocent friend. "Alexey Alexandrovich," she said, looking into his eyes with desperate determination. "I asked you about Anna and you didn't answer me. How is she?" "It seems she's well, Darya Alexandrovna," Alexey Alexandrovich replied without looking at her. "Forgive me, Alexey Alexandrovich, I have no right. But I love and respect Anna like a sister. I beg you, I entreat you to tell me what's wrong between you. What do you accuse her of?" Alexey Alexandrovich winced and, almost closing his eyes, bowed his head. "I suppose your husband has told you the reasons why I consider it necessary to change my former relations with Anna Arkadyevna," he said, not looking in her eyes and glancing with displeasure at Strabutsky who was passing through the drawing room. "I don't believe it, I can't believe it," said Dolly, clasping her bony hands before her with an energetic gesture. She got up quickly and placed her hand on Alexey Alexandrovich's sleeve. "We'll be disturbed here, please. Let's go in there." Dolly's agitation affected Alexey Alexandrovich. He got up and obediently followed her to the schoolroom. They sat down at a table covered with oilcloth cut all over by penknives. "I don't believe it, I just don't believe it," said Dolly, trying to catch his eyes, which avoided hers. "It's impossible not to believe facts, Darya Alexandrovna," he said, stressing the word facts. "But what has she done?" said Darya Alexandrovna. "What precisely has she done?" "She has scorned her obligations and betrayed her husband. That is what she has done," he said. "No, no, it can't be." "No, for God's sake, you're mistaken," said Dolly, touching her temples with her hands and closing her eyes. Alexey Alexandrovich smiled coldly with his lips only, wishing to show her and himself the firmness of his conviction, but this ardent defense, though it did not shake him, rubbed salt into his wound. He spoke with increased animation. "It is rather difficult to be mistaken, when the wife herself announces it to her husband. Announces that 8 years of life and a son, that it was all a mistake and that she wants to live over again," he said, sniffing angrily. "Anna and Vice, I can't put the two together. I can't believe it." "Darya Alexandrovna," he said, now looking straight into Dolly's kind, agitated face and feeling that his tongue was involuntarily loosening. "I would have paid dearly for doubt to be still possible. When I doubted, it was hard for me, but easier than now. When I doubted, there was hope, but now there is no hope and even so I doubt everything. I doubt everything so much that I hate my own son and sometimes do not believe that he is my son. I am very unhappy." He had no need to say it. Darya Alexandrovna understood it as soon as he looked into her face. She felt sorry for him, and her belief in her friend's innocence was shaken. "Ah, it's terrible. Terrible. But is it really true that you've decided on divorce?" "I've decided on the final measure. There's nothing else for me to do." "Nothing to do, nothing to do," she said with tears in her eyes. "No, that's not so," she said. "The terrible thing in this sort of grief is that, unlike anything else, a loss, a death, one cannot simply bear one's cross. Here one must act," he said, as if guessing her thought. "One must get out of the humiliating position one has been put in. It is impossible to live as three." I understand that very well," said Dolly, and she bowed her head. She paused, thinking of herself, of her own family grief, and suddenly raised her head energetically and clasped her hands in a pleading gesture. "But wait, you're a Christian. Think of her. What will become of her if you leave her?" "I have been thinking, Darya Alexandrovna, and thinking a great deal," Alexey Alexandrovich said. His face flushed in spots. His dull eyes looked straight at her. Darya Alexandrovna pitied him now with all her heart. "That is what I did after she herself announced my disgrace to me. I left everything as it had been. I gave her the chance to reform. I tried to save her. And what? She did not fulfill the easiest of requirements, the observance of propriety," he said heatedly. "It is possible to save a person who does not want to perish. But if the whole nature is so corrupt, so perverted, that perdition itself looks like salvation, what can be done?" "Anything, only not divorce," Darya Alexandrovna replied. "But what is this anything?" "No, it's terrible. She'll be no one's wife, she'll be ruined." "What can I do?" said Alexey Alexandrovich, raising his shoulders and his eyebrows. The memory of his wife's last trespass vexed him so much that he again became cold, as at the beginning of their conversation. Thank you very much for your concern, but I must go, he said, getting up. No, wait. You mustn't ruin her. Wait, I'll tell you about myself. I was married, and my husband deceived me. Angry, jealous, I wanted to abandon everything I myself wanted, but I came to my senses, and who saved me? Anna saved me. And so I live. My children are growing up, my husband comes back to the family, he feels he wasn't right, becomes purer, better, and I live. I forgave, and you must forgive. Alexey Alexandrovich listened, but her words no longer affected him. In his soul there arose again all the anger of the day when he had decided on divorce. He shook himself and spoke in a shrill, loud voice. Cannot forgive, I do not want to, and I consider it unjust. I did everything for that woman, and she trampled everything in the mud that is so suitable to her. I am not a wicked man, I have never hated anyone, but her I hate with all the strength of my soul, and I cannot even forgive her, because I hate her so much for all the evil she has done me. He said with tears of anger in his voice. Love those who hate you, Darya Alexandrovna whispered shamefacedly. Alexey Alexandrovich smiled contemptuously. He had long known that, but it could not be applied in his case. Love those who hate you, but to love those you hate is impossible. Forgive me for having upset you. Everyone has enough grief of his own. And, having regained control of himself, Alexey Alexandrovich calmly said goodbye and left. 13. When they got up from the table, Levin wanted to follow Kitty into the drawing room, but he was afraid that she might be displeased by such all too obvious courtship of her on his part. He remained in the men's circle, taking part in the general conversation, but, without looking at Kitty, sensed her movements, her glances, and the place where she was in the drawing room. He began at once, and without the slightest effort, to fulfill the promise he had given her, always to think well of all people and always to love everyone. The conversation turned to village communes, in which Pestov saw some special principle which he called the choral principle. 13. Levin agreed neither with Pestov nor with his brother, who had some way of his own of both agreeing and disagreeing with the significance of the Russian commune. But he talked with them, trying only to reconcile them and soften their objections. He was not the least bit interested in what he said himself, still less in what they said, and desired only one thing, that they and everyone should be nice and agreeable. He now knew the one important thing, and that one thing was at first there in the drawing room, and then began to move on and stopped by the door. Without turning round, he felt a gaze and a smile directed at him and could not help turning. She was standing in the doorway with Shtcherbatsky and looking at him. I thought you were going to the piano, he said, approaching her. That's what I lack in the country, music. No, we were only coming to call you away, and I thank you, she said, awarding him a smile as if it were a gift, for having come. What's all this love of arguing? No one ever convinces anyone else. Yes, true, said Levin. It most often happens that you argue hotly only because you can't understand what precisely your opponent wants to prove. Levin had often noticed in arguments between the most intelligent people that after enormous efforts, an enormous number of logical subtleties and words, the arguers would finally come to the awareness that what they had spent so long struggling to prove to each other had been known to them long, long before, from the beginning of the argument, but that they loved different things and therefore did not want to name what they loved, so as not to be challenged. He had often felt that sometimes during an argument you would understand what your opponent loves, and suddenly come to love the same thing yourself, and agree all at once, and then all reasonings would fall away as superfluous. And sometimes it was the other way round, you would finally say what you yourself love, for the sake of which you are inventing your reasonings, and if you happened to say it well and sincerely, the opponent would suddenly agree and stop arguing. That was the very thing he wanted to say. She wrinkled her forehead, trying to understand. But as soon as he began to explain, she understood. I understand, you must find out what he's arguing for, what he loves, and then you can. She had fully divined and expressed his poorly expressed thought. Levin smiled joyfully, so striking did he find the transition from an intricate, verbose argument with his brother and Pestov to this laconic and clear, almost wordless, communication of the most complex thoughts. Shtcherbatsky left them, and Kitty, going over to an open card table, sat down, took a piece of chalk in her hand and began to trace radiating circles on the new green cloth. They resumed the conversation that had gone on at dinner about the freedom and occupations of women. Levin agreed with Darya Alexandrovna's opinion that a girl who did not get married could find feminine work for herself and her family. He supported it by saying that no family can do without a helper, that in every family, poor or rich, there are and must be nannies, hired or from the family. "No," said Kitty, blushing, but looking at him all the more boldly with her truthful eyes. "A girl can be in such a position that she cannot enter a family without humiliation, while she herself—" He understood from a hint. "Oh, yes," he said, "yes, yes, yes, you're right, you're right." And he understood all that Pestov had been maintaining at dinner about women's freedom, only because he saw the fear of spinsterhood and humiliation in Kitty's heart, and, loving her, he felt that fear and humiliation and at once renounced his arguments. Silence ensued. She went on tracing on the table with the chalk. Her eyes shone with a quiet light. Obedient to her mood, he felt in his whole being the ever-increasing tension of happiness. "Ah, I've scribbled all over the table," she said and, putting down the chalk, made a movement as if she wanted to get up. "How can I stay alone, without her?" he thought with horror, and he took the chalk. "Wait," he said, sitting down at the table. "There's one thing I've long wanted to ask you." He looked straight into her tender though frightened eyes. "Please do." "Here," he said, and wrote the initial letters, W, Y, A, M, T, C, B, D, I, M, N, O, T. These letters meant, "When you answered me, that cannot be." Did it mean never or then? There was no likelihood that she would be able to understand this complex phrase. But he watched her with such a look as if his life depended on her understanding these words. She glanced at him seriously, then leaned her knitted brow on her hand and began to read. Occasionally she glanced at him, asking with her glance, "Is this what I think?" "I understand," she said, blushing. "What is this word?" he said, pointing to the N that signified the word never. "That means the word never," she said, "but it's not true." He quickly erased what was written, gave her the chalk and got up. She wrote, T-I-C-G-N-O-A. Dolly was completely consoled in her grief, caused by her conversation with Alexei Alexandrovich, when she saw these two figures, Kitty, chalk in hand, looking up at Levin with a timid and happy smile, and his handsome figure bent over the table, his burning eyes directed now at the table, now at her. He suddenly beamed. He had understood. It meant, then I could give no other answer. He glanced at her questioningly, timidly. "Only then?" "Yes," her smile replied. "And then, and now?" he asked. "Well, here, read this. I'll tell you what I would wish very much." She wrote the initial letters, T, Y, C, F, A, F, W, H. It meant, that you could forgive and forget what happened. He seized the chalk with his tense, trembling fingers and, breaking it, wrote the initial letters of the following, "I have nothing to forgive and forget, I have never stopped loving you." She glanced at him, the smile staying on her lips. "I understand," she said in a whisper. He sat down and wrote a long phrase. She understood everything and, without asking him if she was right, took the chalk and replied at once. For a long time he could not understand what she had written and kept glancing in her eyes. A darkening came over him from happiness. He simply could not pick out the words she had in mind, but in her lovely eyes shining with happiness he understood everything he needed to know. And he wrote 3 letters. But she was reading after his hand, and before he finished writing, she finished it herself and wrote the answer. "Yes." "Playing secretaire?" said the old prince, approaching. "Well, come along, anyhow, if you want to make it to the theater." Levin stood up and saw Kitty to the door. In their conversation everything had been said, that she loved him, that she would tell her father and mother, that he would come tomorrow in the morning. 14. When Kitty had gone and Levin was left alone, he felt such anxiety without her and such an impatient desire to live quickly, the more quickly, till tomorrow morning, when he would see her again and be united with her forever, that he became afraid, as of death, of those 14 hours that he had to spend without her. He absolutely had to be with and talk to someone, so as not to remain alone, so as to cheat time, Stepan Arkadyevich would have been the most agreeable company for him, but he was going, as he said, to an evening party, though actually to the ballet. Levin only had time to tell him that he was happy, that he loved him and would never, never forget what he had done for him. Stepan Arkadyevich's eyes and smile showed Levin that he had understood this feeling in the right way. "So it's no longer time to die?" said Stepan Arkadyevich, pressing Levin's hand affectionately. "No, oh," said Levin. Darya Alexandrovna, saying goodbye to him, also said, as if congratulating him, "How glad I am that you met Kitty again." One must cherish old friendships. But Levin found these words of Darya Alexandrovna unpleasant. She could not understand how lofty and inaccessible to her it all was, and she should not have dared to mention it. Levin took leave of them, but, so as not to be left alone, latched on to his brother. "Where are you going?" "To a meeting." "Well, I'll go with you." "May I?" "Why not?" "Come along," said Sergei Ivanovich, smiling. "What's got into you tonight?" "Into me?" "Happiness has got into me," said Levin, letting down the window of the coach they were riding in. "You don't mind?" "It's stuffy." "Happiness has got into me." "Why have you never married?" Sergei Ivanovich smiled. "I'm very glad. She seems to be a nice GI." Sergei Ivanovich began. "Don't speak, don't speak, don't speak," Levin cried, seizing him by the collar of his fur coat with both hands and wrapping him up. "She's a nice girl" was such a simple, such a low phrase, so out of harmony with his feeling. Sergei Ivanovich laughed a merry laugh, which happened to him rarely. "Well, anyhow I can say that I'm very glad of it." "Tomorrow you can, and no more of that." Never mind, never mind." "Silence." 14, said Levin and, wrapping him in his fur coat once more, added, "I love you very much." "So, can I be present at the meeting?" "Of course you can." "What are you discussing tonight?" Levin asked, without ceasing to smile. They arrived at the meeting. Levin listened as the secretary haltingly read the minutes, which he evidently did not understand himself, but Levin could see by the face of this secretary what a sweet, kind and nice man he was. It could be seen from the way he became confused and embarrassed as he read the minutes. Then the speeches began. They argued about allotting certain sums and installing certain pipes, and Sergei Ivanovich needled two members and triumphantly spoke at length about something, and another member, having written something on a piece of paper, at first turned timid, but then responded to him quite venomously and sweetly. And then Sviazhsky, he, too, was there, also said something ever so beautifully and nobly. Levin listened to them and saw clearly that neither those allotted sums nor the pipes existed, and that none of them was angry. They were all such kind, nice people and things all went so nicely and sweetly among them. They did not bother anyone, and everyone felt pleased. What Levin found remarkable was that he could see through them all that night, and by small tokens, inconspicuous before, could recognize the soul of each and see clearly that they were all kind. In particular it was him, Levin, that they all loved so much that night. It could be seen by the way they spoke to him and looked at him tenderly, lovingly, even all the strangers. "Well, are you pleased?" Sergei Ivanovich asked him. "Very." "I never thought it could be so interesting." "Fine. Splendid." Sviazhsky came up to Levin and invited him for tea at his place. Levin simply could not understand or recall what had displeased him in Sviazhsky and what he had been looking for from him. He was an intelligent and remarkably kind man. "Delighted," he said, and asked after his wife and sister-in-law. And by a strange filiation of ideas, since in his imagination the thought of Sviazhsky's sister-in-law was connected with marriage, he decided that there could be no one better to tell of his happiness than Sviazhsky's wife and sister-in-law, and he would be very glad to go and see them. Sviazhsky asked him about his work on the estate, as always, not allowing any possibility of finding anything not yet found in Europe, and now this was not the least bit unpleasant for Levin. On the contrary, he felt that Sviazhsky was right, that the whole thing was worthless, and noted the surprisingly mild and gentle way in which Sviazhsky avoided saying how right he was. Sviazhsky's ladies were especially sweet. It seemed to Levin that they already knew everything and sympathized with him, and did not say so only out of delicacy. He stayed with them for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, talking about various subjects, but having in mind the one thing that filled his soul, and not noticing that he was boring them terribly and that it was long since time for them to go to bed. Sviazhsky, yawning, saw him to the front hall, wondering at the strange state his friend was in. It was past 1 o'clock. Levin went back to his hotel and became frightened at the thought of how he, alone now with his impatience, was going to spend the remaining 10 hours. The lackey on duty was not asleep, lit candles for him and was about to leave, but Levin stopped him. This lackey, Jaeger, whom Levin had never noticed before, turned out to be a very intelligent and good man, and, above all, a kind one. "So, Jaeger, is it hard not sleeping?" "No help for it. That's our job. It's easier in a master's house, but the reckoning's bigger here." It turned out that Jaeger had a family, 3 boys and a daughter, a seamstress, whom he wanted to marry to a sales assistant in a saddler's shop. Levin took this occasion to convey to Jaeger his thought that the main thing in marriage was love, and that with love one was always happy, because happiness exists only in oneself. Jaeger heard him out attentively and evidently understood Levin's thought fully, but to corroborate it he made the observation, unexpected for Levin, that when he had lived with good masters he had always been pleased with them, and he was quite pleased with his master now, though he was a Frenchman. A remarkably kind man, thought Levin. "Well, and you, Jaeger, when you got married, did you love your wife?" "Of course I loved her," answered Jaeger. And Levin saw that Jaeger was also in a rapturous state and intended to voice all his innermost feelings. "My life is also remarkable. Ever since I was little, he began, his eyes shining, obviously infected by Levin's rapture, just as people get infected by yawning. But at that moment the bell rang, Jaeger went out, and Levin was left alone. He had eaten almost nothing at dinner, had declined tea and supper at the Sviazhskys, but could not think of eating. He had not slept last night, but could not even think of sleeping. The room was cool, yet he felt stifled by the heat. He opened both vent panes and sat on the table facing them. Beyond the snow-covered roof he could see an open-work cross with chains and rising above it the triangular constellation of the charioteer with the bright yellowish cupola. He gazed first at the cross, then at the star, breathed in the fresh, frosty air that steadily entered the room, and followed, as in a dream, the images and memories that arose in his imagination. Towards 4 o'clock he heard footsteps in the corridor and looked out of the door. It was the gambler Myaskin, whom he knew, returning from the club. He was walking gloomily, scowling and clearing his throat. "Poor, unfortunate man," thought Levin, and tears came to his eyes from love and pity for the man. He wanted to talk to him, to comfort him, but, remembering that he had nothing on but a shirt, he changed his mind and again sat by the vent to bathe in the cold air and gaze at the wondrous form of the cross, silent but full of meaning for him, and at the soaring, bright yellow star. After 6 o'clock the floor polishers began to make noise, bells rang for some service and Levin felt that he was beginning to be cold. He closed the vent, washed, dressed and went out. 15. The streets were still empty. Levin walked to the Shtcherbatskys' house. The front door was locked and all was asleep. He walked back, went to his room and asked for coffee. The day lackey, not Jaeger now, brought it to him. He wanted to get into conversation with the lackey, but they rang for him and he left. Levin tried to drink some coffee and put the roll in his mouth, but his mouth decidedly did not know what to do with it. He spat out the roll, put on his coat and again went out to walk around. It was past 9 when he came to the Shtcherbatskys' porch for the second time. In the house they were just getting up, and the cook had gone to buy provisions. He had to live through at least another 2 hours. All that night and morning Levin had lived completely unconsciously and had felt himself completely removed from the conditions of material life. He had not eaten for a whole day, had not slept for 2 nights, had spent several hours undressed in the freezing cold, yet felt not only fresh and healthy as never before but completely independent of his body. He moved without any muscular effort and felt he could do anything. He was certain that he could fly into the air or lift up the corner of the house if need be. He spent the rest of the time walking the streets, constantly looking at his watch and gazing about him. And what he saw then, he afterwards never saw again. He was especially moved by children going to school, the gray-blue pigeons that flew down from the roof to the pavement, and the white rolls sprinkled with flour that some invisible hand had set out. These rolls, the pigeons and the 2 boys were unearthly beings. All this happened at the same time. A boy ran up to a pigeon and, smiling, looked at Levin. The pigeon flapped its wings and fluttered off, sparkling in the sun amidst the air trembling with snow dust, while the smell of baked bread wafted from the window as the rolls appeared in it. All this together was so extraordinarily good that Levin laughed and wept from joy. Making a big circle along Gazetny Lane and Kislovka, he went back to his hotel again and, placing his watch in front of him, sat down to wait till 12 o'clock. In the next room they were saying something about machines and cheating, and coughing morning coughs. They did not realize that the hand was already approaching 12. The hand reached 12. Levin went out to the porch. The cabbies evidently knew everything. They surrounded him with happy faces, vying among themselves and offering their services, trying not to offend the others and promising to ride with them, too. Levin hired one cabbie and told him to go to the Shtcherbatskys. The cabbie was charming, with his white shirt collar sticking out from under his kaftan and buttoned tightly on his full, strong, red neck. This cabbie's sleigh was high, smart, the like of which Levin never drove in again, and the horse was fine and tried to run, but did not move from the spot. The cabbie knew the Shtcherbatskys' house and, with particular deference to his fare, rounded his arms and shouted "Whoa!" as he pulled up at the entrance. The Shtcherbatskys' hall porter certainly knew everything. That could be seen by the smile of his eyes and the way he said, "Well, you haven't been here for a long time, Konstantin Dmitrich." Not only did he know everything, but he was obviously exultant and was making efforts to hide his joy. Looking into his dear old eyes, Levin even understood something new in his happiness. "Are they up? Come in, please." "You might leave it here," he said, smiling, as Levin was about to go back for his hat. "That must have meant something." "To whom shall I announce you?" asked the footman. The footman, though young and of the new sort, a dandy, was a very kind and good man, and also understood everything. "The princess, the prince, the young princess," said Levin. The first person he saw was Milena. She passed through the room, her curls and face beaming. No sooner had he addressed her than the rustle of a dress was suddenly heard behind the door, and Milena vanished from Levin's sight, and the joyful terror of the nearness of his happiness communicated itself to him. Milena hastened away and, leaving him, went to the other door. As soon as she went out, there came the sound of quick, light steps over the parquet, and his happiness, his life, he himself, better than his own self, that which he had sought and desired for so long, was quickly approaching him. She did not walk but by some invisible force rushed towards him. He saw only her clear, truthful eyes, frightened by the same joy of love that filled his heart. Those eyes shone nearer and nearer, blinding him by their light of love. She stopped up close to him, touching him. Her arms rose and came down on his shoulders. She had done all she could. She had run up to him and given all of herself, timidly and joyfully. He embraced her and pressed his lips to her mouth that sought his kiss. She, too, had not slept all night and all morning had been waiting for him. Her mother and father had consented without question and were happy in her happiness. She had been waiting for him. She had wanted to be the first to announce to him her happiness and his. She had been preparing to meet him alone and rejoiced at the thought of it, and felt timid, and bashful, and did not know herself what she would do. She had heard his footsteps and voice and had waited behind the door till Milena left. Without thinking, without asking herself how or what, she had gone up to him and done what she had done. "Let's go to Mama," she said, taking him by the hand. For a long time he could say nothing, not so much because he was afraid to spoil the loftiness of his feeling with words, as because each time he wanted to say something he felt that, instead of words, tears of happiness were about to burst out. He took her hand and kissed it. "Can this be true?" he said finally in a muted voice. "I can't believe you love me." She smiled at these words and at the timidity with which he glanced at her. "Yes," she said meaningly and slowly. "I'm so happy." Without letting go of his hand, she went into the drawing room. The princess, seeing them, began breathing quickly and immediately broke down in tears, then immediately burst out laughing and, running to them with energetic strides that Levin would never have expected of her, embraced his head, kissed him and wetted his cheeks with tears. "So it's all settled." "I'm glad. Love her." "I'm glad, Kitty." "That was quick work," said the old prince, trying to be indifferent, but Levin noticed that his eyes were moist when he addressed him. I've always wished for this," he said, taking Levin's hand and drawing him to him. Even then, when this flighty one took a notion. Papa! Kitty cried and covered his mouth with her hand. Well, all right, he said. I'm very, very happy. Ah, how stupid I am. He embraced Kitty, kissed her face, her hand, her face again, and made the sign of the cross over her. And Levin was overcome by a new feeling of love for this man previously a stranger to him, the old prince, when he saw how long and tenderly Kitty kissed his fleshy hand. 16. The princess sat in an armchair, silent and smiling. The prince sat beside her. Kitty stood by her father's chair, still holding his hand. Everyone was silent. The princess was the first to put names to things and translate all thoughts and feelings into questions of life, and it seemed equally strange and even painful to them all in the first moment. So, when? We must bless you and announce it, and when will the wedding be? What do you think, Alexander? He's the one, said the old prince, pointing at Levin. He's the chief person here. When? Said Levin, blushing. Tomorrow. If you ask me, in my opinion, the blessing today and the wedding tomorrow. Come, mon cher, that's foolishness. Well, in a week, then. He's quite mad. No, why? Mercy, said the mother, smiling joyfully at his haste. And the trousseau? Will there really be a trousseau and all that? Levin thought with horror. And yet, can the trousseau, and the blessing, and all that, can it spoil my happiness? Nothing can spoil it. He glanced at Kitty and noticed that she was not the least bit offended at the thought of a trousseau. So it's necessary, he thought. I really don't know anything, I only said what I wish, he said, apologizing. Then we'll decide. We can give the blessing and make the announcement now. That's so. The princess went up to her husband, kissed him and was about to leave, but he held her back, embraced her and tenderly, like a young lover, smiling, kissed her several times. The old folk evidently got confused for a moment and could not quite tell whether it was they who were in love again, or only their daughter. When the prince and princess left, Levin went up to his fiancée and took her hand. He had now gained control of himself and could speak, and there was much that he needed to tell her. But he said not at all what he meant to. How I knew it would be so. I never hoped, but in my soul I was always sure, he said. I believe it was predestined. And I, she said, even when, she stopped and then went on, looking at him resolutely with her truthful eyes, even when I pushed my happiness away from me. I always loved you alone, but I was infatuated. I must tell, can you forget it? Maybe it was for the better. You must forgive me many things. I must tell you. This was one of the things he had resolved to tell her. He had resolved to tell her two things in the very first days. One, that he was not as pure as she was, and the other, that he was an unbeliever. It was painful, but he considered that he ought to tell her both the one and the other. No, not now, later, he said. Very well, later, but you absolutely must tell me. I'm not afraid of anything. I must know everything. It's settled now. He finished the phrase, settled that you'll take me however I used to be, that you won't renounce me? Yes, yes, yes. Their conversation was interrupted by Milena, who, smiling falsely but tenderly, came to congratulate her favorite charge. Before she left, the servants came with their congratulations. Then relatives arrived, and that blissful tumult began from which Levin did not escape till the day after his wedding. Levin felt constantly awkward, bored, but the tension of happiness went on, ever increasing. He kept feeling that much that he did not know was demanded of him, and he did everything he was told and it all made him happy. He thought that his engagement would have nothing in common with others, that the ordinary conditions of engagement would spoil his particular happiness, but it ended with him doing the same things as others, and his happiness was only increased by it and became more and more special, the like of which had never been known and never would be. Now we'll have some sweets, Milena would say, and Levin would go to buy sweets. Well, I'm very glad, said Sviazhsky. I advise you to buy flowers at Fomin's. Must I? And he went to Fomin's. His brother told him that he would have to borrow money, because there would be many expenses, presents. Must there be presents? And he galloped off to Fulda's. 15. At the confectioner's, at Fomin's and at Fulda's he saw that they expected him, were glad to see him, and celebrated his happiness just as did everyone he had to deal with during those days. The extraordinary thing was not only that everyone loved him, but that all formerly unsympathetic, cold, indifferent people admired him and obeyed him in all things, treated his feeling with tenderness and delicacy, and shared his conviction that he was the happiest man in the world because his fiancée was the height of perfection. And Kitty felt the same. When Countess Nordstein allowed herself to hint that she had wished for something better, Kitty flew into such a passion and proved so persuasively that nothing in the world could be better than Levin, that Countess Nordstein had to admit it and never afterwards met Levin in Kitty's presence without a smile of admiration. The explanation he had promised was the one painful event during that time. He discussed it with the old prince and, having obtained his permission, gave Kitty his diary, in which he had written down what tormented him. He had written this diary with his future fiancée in mind. Two things tormented him: his impurity and his unbelief. His confession of unbelief went unnoticed. She was religious, had never doubted the truths of religion, but his external unbelief did not affect her in the least. She knew his whole soul through love, and in his soul she saw what she wanted, and if such a state of soul was called unbelief, it made no difference to her. But the other confession made her weep bitterly. It was not without inner struggle that Levin gave her his diary. He knew that there could not and should not be any secrets between them, and therefore he decided that it had to be so, but he did not realize how it might affect her. He did not put himself in her place. Only when he came to them that evening before the theater, went to her room and saw her tear-stained, pathetic and dear face, miserable from the irremediable grief he had caused her, did he understand the abyss that separated his shameful past from her dove-like purity and feel horrified at what he had done. "Take them, take these terrible books," she said, pushing away the notebooks that lay before her on the table. "Why did you give them to me?" "No, all the same it's better," she added, taking pity on his desperate face. "But it's terrible, terrible." He bowed his head and was silent. There was nothing he could say. "You won't forgive me," he whispered. "No, I've forgiven you, but it's terrible." However, his happiness was so great that this confession did not destroy it, but only added a new shade to it. She forgave him, but after that he considered himself still more unworthy of her, bowed still lower before her morally, and valued still more highly his undeserved happiness. 17. Involuntarily going over in his memory the impressions of the conversations during and after dinner, Alexey Alexandrovich went back to his lonely hotel room. Darya Alexandrovna's words about forgiveness produced nothing in him but vexation. The applicability or non-applicability of the Christian rule to his own case was too difficult a question, one about which it was impossible to speak lightly, and this question Alexey Alexandrovich had long ago decided in the negative. Of all that had been said, the words that had sunk deepest into his imagination were those of the stupid, kindly Trovtsin, acted like a real man, challenged him to a duel and killed him. They all obviously sympathized with that, though out of politeness they did not say so. "Anyhow, the matter's settled, there's no point in thinking about it," Alexey Alexandrovich said to himself. And, thinking only of his impending departure and the inspection business, he went into his room and asked the porter who had accompanied him where his valet was. The porter said that the valet had just left. Alexey Alexandrovich asked to have tea served, sat down at the table and, taking up from 16, began working out the itinerary of his trip. "2 telegrams," said the valet, coming back into the room. "Excuse me, Your Excellency, I just stepped out." Alexey Alexandrovich took the telegrams and opened them. The first was the news of Strumov's appointment to the very post Karenin had desired. Alexey Alexandrovich threw down the dispatch and, turning red, got up and began to pace the room. "Volt perdere dementat," he said, meaning by those persons who had furthered this appointment. He was not vexed so much by the fact that it was not he who had obtained the post, that he had obviously been passed over. What he found incomprehensible and astonishing was how they could not see that the babbler, the phrasemonger Strumov was less fit for the job than anyone else. How could they not see that they were ruining themselves and their prestige by this appointment? "Something else of the same sort," he said biliously to himself, opening the second dispatch. The telegram was from his wife. Her signature in blue pencil -Anna- was the first thing that struck his eyes. "Am dying, beg, implore you come. Will die more peacefully with forgiveness," he read. He smiled contemptuously and threw down the telegram. There could be no doubt, it seemed to him in that first moment, that this was a trick and a deception. She wouldn't stop at any deception. She's due to give birth. Maybe the illness is childbirth. But what is their goal? To legitimize the child, to compromise me and prevent the divorce. he thought. But there's those whom God would destroy he first makes mad. Something it says there, am dying. He reread the telegram, and suddenly the direct meaning of what it said struck him. And what if it's true? He said to himself. If it's true that in the moment of suffering and near death she sincerely repents and I, taking it for deception, refuse to come, it would not only be cruel, and everybody would condemn me, but it would be stupid on my part. Pyotr, cancel the coach. I'm going to Petersburg, he said to the valet. Alexei Alexandrovich decided that he would go to Petersburg and see his wife. If her illness was a deception, he would say nothing and go away. If she was really ill and dying, and wished to see him before she died, he would forgive her if he found her alive, and fulfill his final duty if he came too late. For the whole way he gave no more thought to what he was to do. With the feeling of fatigue and uncleanness that comes from a night on the train, in the early mist of Petersburg, Alexei Alexandrovich drove down the deserted Nevsky and stared straight ahead, not thinking of what awaited him. He could not think of it because, when he imagined what was to be, he could not rid himself of the thought that death would resolve at a stroke all the difficulty of his situation. Bakers, locked-up shops, night cabs, caretakers sweeping the pavements, flashed past his eyes, and he observed it all, trying to stifle within himself the thought of what awaited him and what he dared not wish but wished all the same. He drove up to the porch. A cab and a coach with a sleeping coachman stood at the entrance. As he went into the front hall, Alexei Alexandrovich drew a resolution, as it were, from a far corner of his brain and consulted it. It read, if it is a deception, then calm contempt, and depart. If true, observe propriety. The hall porter opened the door even before Alexei Alexandrovich rang. The porter Petrov, also called Kapitanich, looked strange in an old frock coat, with no tie and in slippers. How is the mistress? Safely delivered yesterday. Alexei Alexandrovich stopped and went pale. He now realized clearly how strongly he had desired her death. And her health. Kornai, in a morning apron, came running down the stairs. Very bad, he answered. Yesterday there was a doctor's consultation, and the doctor is here now. Take my things, said Alexei Alexandrovich and, feeling slightly relieved at the news that there was after all some hope of death, he went into the front hall. There was a military coat on the rack. Alexei Alexandrovich noticed it and asked, who is here? The doctor, the midwife and Count Vronsky. Alexei Alexandrovich walked into the inner rooms. There was no one in the drawing room. At the sound of his footsteps the midwife came out of the boudoir in a cap with violet ribbons. She went up to Alexei Alexandrovich and with the familiarity that comes from the nearness of death took him by the arm and led him to the bedroom. Thank God you've come. She talks only of you, she said. Quickly fetch some ice. The doctor's peremptory voice said from the bedroom. Alexei Alexandrovich went into her boudoir. At her desk, his side to the back of the low chair, sat Vronsky, his face buried in his hands, weeping. At the sound of the doctor's voice he jumped up, took his hands away from his face, and saw Alexei Alexandrovich. Seeing the husband, he was so embarrassed that he sat down again, drawing his head down between his shoulders as if he wished to disappear somewhere, but he made an effort, stood up and said, she's dying. The doctors say there's no hope. I am entirely at your mercy, but allow me to be here. However, I shall do as you please. Alexei Alexandrovich, seeing Vronsky's tears, felt a surge of that inner disturbance that the sight of other people's suffering produced in him, and, averting his face, without waiting for him to finish, he hastily went to the door. From the bedroom came Anna's voice saying something. Her voice was gay, animated, with extremely distinct intonations. Alexei Alexandrovich went into the bedroom and approached the bed. She lay with her face turned towards him. Her cheeks were flushed red, her eyes shone, her small white hands, sticking out of the cuffs of her jacket, toyed with the corner of the blanket, twisting it. She seemed not only healthy and fresh but also in the best of spirits. She spoke quickly, sonorously, and with unusually regular and deep-felt intonations. Because Alexei, I am speaking of Alexei Alexandrovich, such a strange, terrible fate, that they're both Alexei, isn't it? Alexei wouldn't refuse me. I would have forgotten, he would have forgiven, but why doesn't he come? He's kind, he himself doesn't know how kind he is. Ah, my God, what anguish. Give me water, quickly. Ah, it will be bad for her, for my little girl. Well, all right, let her have a wet nurse. I agree, It's even better. He'll come. It will be painful for him to see her. Take her away. Anna Arkadyevna, he has come. Here he is," said the midwife, trying to draw her attention to Alexey Alexandrovitch. "Ah, what nonsense!" Anna went on, not seeing her husband. "But give her to me. Give me my little girl." "He hasn't come yet." "You say he won't forgive, because you don't know him." "No one ever knew him. Only I did, and even for me it was hard." "His eyes, you should know, Seryosha has the same eyes. That's why I can't look at them." "Did Seryosha have his dinner?" "I know everybody will forget." "He wouldn't have forgotten." "You must move Seryosha to the corner room and ask Mariette to sleep with him." Suddenly she shrank, fell silent and fearfully, as if expecting to be struck, as if shielding herself, raised her hands to her face. She had seen her husband. "No, no," she began, "I'm not afraid of him. I'm afraid of death." "Alexey, come here." "I'm hurrying because I have no time. I haven't long to live. I'll be feverish soon and won't understand anything." "Now I do understand. I understand everything. I see everything." Alexey Alexandrovitch's pinched face acquired a suffering expression. He took her hand and wanted to say something, but was quite unable to speak. His lower lip trembled, but he kept struggling with his agitation and only occasionally glanced at her. And each time he glanced at her, he saw her eyes, which looked at him with such moved and rapturous tenderness as he had never seen in them before. "Wait, you don't know. Wait, wait, all of you." She stopped, as if trying to collect her thoughts. "Yes," she began. "Yes, yes, yes. This is what I wanted to say. Don't be surprised at me. I'm the same, but there is another woman in me. I'm afraid of her. She fell in love with that man, and I wanted to hate you and couldn't forget the other one who was there before. The one who is not me. Now I'm real. I'm whole. I'm dying now. I know I'll die. Ask him. I feel weights now. Here they are, on my hands, my feet, my fingers. My fingers are like this, enormous. But it will all end soon. There's one thing I need. Forgive me completely. I'm terrible, but my nanny told me, that holy martyr, what was her name? She was worse. 17, I'll go to Rome, too. There are deserts there, and then I won't bother anybody. I'll take only Seryosha and my little girl. No, you can't forgive me. I know this can't be forgiven. No, no, go away. You're too good." With one hot hand she held his hand, and with the other she pushed him away. Alexey Alexandrovitch's inner disturbance kept growing and now reached such a degree that he ceased to struggle with it. He suddenly felt that what he had considered an inner disturbance was, on the contrary, a blissful state of soul, which suddenly gave him a new, previously unknown happiness. He was not thinking that the Christian law which he had wanted to follow all his life prescribed that he forgive and love his enemies, but the joyful feeling of love and forgiveness of his enemies filled his soul. He knelt down and, placing his head on the crook of her arm, which burned him like fire through her jacket, sobbed like a child. She embraced his balding head, moved closer to him, and raised her eyes with defiant pride. "Here he is. I knew it. Now goodbye all. Goodbye. Again they've come. Why don't they go away? And do take these fur coats off me." The doctor took her arms away, carefully laid her back on the pillow and covered her shoulders. She lay back obediently and gazed straight ahead of her with radiant eyes. "Remember one thing, that all I need is forgiveness, and I want nothing more, nothing." "Why doesn't he come?" she said, addressing Vronsky through the door. "Come here, come, give him your hand." Vronsky came to the side of the bed and, seeing her, again covered his face with his hands. "Uncover your face. Look at him. He's a saint," she said. "No, uncover it. Uncover your face," she said crossly. "Alexey Alexandrovitch, uncover his face. I want to see him." Alexey Alexandrovitch took Vronsky's hands and drew them away from his face, terrible in the expression of suffering and shame that was on it. "Give him your hand. Forgive him." Alexey Alexandrovitch gave him his hand, not holding back the tears that poured from his eyes. Thank God, she said. "Now everything is ready. Just let me stretch my legs a little. There, that's wonderful. How tastelessly these flowers are done, quite unlike violets," she said, pointing to the wallpaper. My God, when will it end? Give me morphine. Doctor, give me morphine. Oh, my God. And she began thrashing about in her bed. The doctor and his colleagues said it was puerperal fever, which in 99 cases out of 100 ends in death. All day there was fever, delirium and unconsciousness. By midnight the sick woman lay without feeling and almost without pulse. The end was expected at any moment. Vronsky went home, but came in the morning to inquire, and Alexey Alexandrovich, meeting him in the front hall, said, "Stay, she may ask for you," and himself led him to his wife's boudoir. Towards morning the excitement, liveliness, quickness of thought and speech began again, and again ended in unconsciousness. On the third day it was the same, and the doctors said there was hope. That day Alexey Alexandrovich came to the boudoir where Vronsky was sitting and, closing the door, sat down facing him. "Alexey Alexandrovich," said Vronsky, feeling that a talk was imminent, "I am unable to speak, unable to understand. Spare me. However painful it is for you, believe me, it is still more terrible for me." He was about to get up, but Alexey Alexandrovich took his hand and said, "I beg you to hear me out, it's necessary. I must explain my feelings to you, those that have guided me and those that will guide me, so that you will not be mistaken regarding me. You know that I had decided on a divorce and had even started proceedings. I won't conceal from you that, when I started proceedings, I was undecided, I suffered, I confess that I was driven by a desire for revenge on you and on her. When I received her telegram, I came here with the same feelings. I will say more, I wished for her death. But..." He paused, pondering whether to reveal his feelings to him or not. "But I saw her and I forgave. And the happiness of forgiveness revealed my duty to me. I forgave her completely. I want to turn the other cheek. I want to give my shirt when my kaftan is taken, and I only pray to God that he not take from me the happiness of forgiveness." Tears welled up in his eyes, and their luminous, serene look struck Vronsky. "That is my position. You may trample me in the mud, make me the laughingstock of society. I will not abandon her. I will never say a word of reproach to you," he went on. "My duty is clearly ordained for me. I must be with her and I will be. If she wishes to see you, I will let you know. But now I suppose it will be better if you leave." He stood up, and sobs broke off his speech. Vronsky also got up and in a stooping, unstraightened posture looked at him from under his brows. He did not understand Alexey Alexandrovich's feelings, but he felt that this was something lofty and even inaccessible to him in his world view. 18. After his conversation with Alexey Alexandrovich, Vronsky went out to the porch of the Karenins' house and stopped, hardly remembering where he was and where he had to go or drive. He felt himself shamed, humiliated, guilty and deprived of any possibility of washing away his humiliation. He felt himself thrown out of the rut he had been following so proudly and easily till then. All the habits and rules of his life, which had seemed so firm, suddenly turned out to be false and inapplicable. The deceived husband, who till then had seemed a pathetic being, an accidental and somewhat comic hindrance to his happiness, had suddenly been summoned by her and raised to an awesome height, and on that height the husband appeared not wicked, not false, not ludicrous, but kind, simple and majestic. Vronsky could not but feel it. The roles had been suddenly changed. Vronsky felt Karenin's loftiness and his own abasement, Karenin's tightness and his own wrongness. He felt that the husband had been magnanimous even in his grief, while he had been mean and petty in his deceit. But this realization of his meanness before the man he had unjustly despised made up only a small part of his grief. He felt himself inexpressibly unhappy now, because his passion for Anna, which had been cooling, as it had seemed to him, in recent days, now, when he knew he had lost her forever, had become stronger than it had ever been. He had seen the whole of her during her illness, had come to know her soul, and it seemed to him that he had never loved her before then. And now, when he had come to know her, to love her as he ought to have loved her, he had been humiliated before her and had lost her forever, leaving her with nothing but a disgraceful memory of himself. Most terrible of all had been his ridiculous, shameful position when Alexey Alexandrovich tore his hands from his ashamed face. He stood on the porch of the Karenins' house like a lost man and did not know what to do. "Shall I call a cab?" asked the porter. "A cab? Yes." Returning home after 3 sleepless nights, Vronsky lay face down on the sofa without undressing, his arms folded and his head resting on them. His head was heavy. Images, memories and the strangest thoughts followed one another with extreme rapidity and clarity. Now it was the medicine he had poured for the sick woman, overfilling the spoon, now the midwife's white arms, now Alexey Alexandrovich's strange position on the floor beside the bed. Sleep, forget, he said to himself with the calm certainty of a healthy man that, if he was tired and wanted to sleep, he would fall asleep at once. And indeed at that moment there was confusion in his head, and he began to fall into the abyss of oblivion. The waves of the sea of unconsciousness were already beginning to close over his head when suddenly, as if a strong electric shock was discharged in him, he gave such a start that his whole body jumped on the springs of the sofa and, propping himself with his arms, he got to his knees. His eyes were wide open, as if he had never slept. The heaviness of head and sluggishness of limb that he had experienced a moment before suddenly vanished. You may trample me in the mud. He heard Alexey Alexandrovich's words and saw him before his eyes, and he saw Anna's face with its feverish flush and shining eyes, looking tenderly and lovingly not at him but at Alexey Alexandrovich. He saw his own stupid and ridiculous figure, as it seemed to him, when Alexey Alexandrovich drew his hands away from his face. He stretched his legs out again, threw himself on the sofa in the same position, and closed his eyes. Sleep, sleep, he repeated to himself. But with his eyes closed he saw still more clearly the face of Anna as it had been on that evening, so memorable for him, before the race. It is not and will not be, and she wishes to wipe it from her memory. And I cannot live without it. How can we be reconciled? He said aloud, and began unconsciously to repeat these words. The repetition of the words held back the emergence of new images and memories which he felt thronging in his head. But not for long. Again, one after another, the best moments presented themselves with extreme rapidity, and together with them the recent humiliation. Take your hands away, Anna's voice says. He takes his hands away and senses the ashamed and stupid look on his face. He went on lying there, trying to fall asleep, though he felt that there was not the slightest hope, and he went on repeating in a whisper the accidental words of some thought, wishing to hold back the emergence of new images. He listened, and heard, repeated in a strange, mad whisper, the words, unable to value, unable to enjoy, unable to value, unable to enjoy. What is this? Or am I losing my mind? He said to himself. Maybe so. Why else do people lose their minds? Why else do they shoot themselves? He answered himself and, opening his eyes, was surprised to see an embroidered pillow by his head, made by Varya, his brother's wife. He touched the pillow's tassel and tried to recall Varya and when he had seen her last. But to think of something extraneous was painful. No, I must sleep. He moved the pillow and pressed his head to it, but he had to make an effort to keep his eyes closed. He sat up abruptly. That is finished for me, he said to himself. I must think what to do. What's left? His thought quickly ran through his life apart from his love for Anna. Ambition, Serpukhov, society, court. He could not fix on any of them. That had all had meaning once, but now nothing remained of it. He got up from the sofa, took off his frock coat, loosened his belt and, baring his shaggy chest in order to breathe more freely, paced up and down the room. This is how people lose their minds, he repeated, and shoot themselves, so as not to be ashamed. He added slowly. He went to the door and closed it. Then with a fixed gaze and tightly clenched teeth he went to the table, took his revolver, examined it, turned it to a loaded chamber, and lapsed into thought. For a couple of minutes, his head bowed in an expression of mental effort. He stood motionless with the revolver in his hands and considered. Of course, he said to himself, as if a logical, continuous and clear train of thought had brought him to an unquestionable conclusion. In fact, this of course that he found so convincing was only the consequence of a repetition of exactly the same round of memories and notions that he had already gone through a dozen times within the hour. It was the same memory of happiness lost forever, the same notion of the meaninglessness of everything he saw ahead of him in life, the same consciousness of his humiliation. The sequence of these notions and feelings was also the same. Of course, he repeated, when his thoughts started for the third time on the same enchanted round of memories and thoughts, and, putting the revolver to the left side of his chest and forcefully jerking his whole hand as if clenching it into a fist, he pulled the trigger. He did not hear the sound of the shot, but a strong blow to his chest knocked him off his feet. He tried to catch hold of the edge of the table, dropped the revolver, staggered and sat down on the floor, looking around himself in surprise. He did not recognize his room as he looked from below at the curved legs of the table, the waste-paper basket and the tiger-skin rug. The quick, creaking steps of his servant, walking through the drawing room, brought him to his senses. He made a mental effort and understood that he was on the floor, and, seeing blood on the tiger-skin and on his hand, understood that he had tried to shoot himself. "Stupid. I missed," he said, groping for the revolver with his hand. The revolver was close by him, but he groped for it further away. Continuing to search, he reached out on the other side and, unable to keep his balance, fell over, bleeding profusely. The elegant servant with side whiskers, who had complained to his acquaintances more than once about the weakness of his nerves, was so frightened when he saw his master lying on the floor that he left him bleeding profusely while he ran for help. An hour later, Varya, his brother's wife, came and with the help of 3 doctors, whom she had summoned from all sides and who arrived at the same time, laid the wounded man in bed and stayed there to look after him. 19. The mistake Alexei Alexandrovich had made, while preparing to see his wife, in not taking into account the eventuality that her repentance would be sincere and he would forgive her, and then she would not die. This mistake presented itself to him in all its force 2 months after his return from Moscow. But the mistake came not only from his not having taken this eventuality into account, but also from the fact that, prior to the day when he saw his dying wife, he had not known his own heart. At his wife's bedside he had given himself for the first time in his life to that feeling of tender compassion which other people's suffering evoked in him, and which he had previously been ashamed of as a bad weakness. Pity for her, and repentance at having wished for her death, and above all the very joy of forgiveness, made it so that he suddenly felt not only relief from his suffering but also an inner peace that he had never experienced before. He suddenly felt that the very thing that had once been the source of his suffering had become the source of his spiritual joy, that what had seemed insoluble when he condemned, reproached and hated, became simple and clear when he forgave and loved. He forgave his wife and pitied her for her sufferings and repentance. He forgave Vronsky and pitied him, especially after rumors reached him of his desperate act. He also pitied his son more than before, and now reproached himself for having been too little concerned with him. But for the newborn little girl he had some special feeling, not only of pity but also of tenderness. At first it was only out of compassion that he concerned himself with the newborn, weak little girl, who was not his daughter and who was neglected during her mother's illness and would probably have died if he had not looked after her, and he did not notice how he came to love her. He went to the nursery several times a day and sat there for a long while, so that the wet nurse and the nanny, who were intimidated at first, became used to him. He would sometimes spend half an hour silently gazing at the saffron-red, downy and wrinkled little face of the sleeping baby, watching the movements of her scowling forehead and plump little hands with curled fingers that rubbed her little eyes and nose with their backs. At such moments especially Alexei Alexandrovich felt utterly at peace and in harmony with himself, and saw nothing extraordinary in his situation, nothing that needed to be changed. But the more time that passed, the more clearly he saw that, natural as this situation was for him now, he would not be allowed to remain in it. He felt that, besides the good spiritual force that guided his soul, there was another force, crude and equally powerful, if not more so, that guided his life, and that this force would not give him the humble peace he desired. He felt that everybody looked at him with questioning surprise, not understanding him and expecting something from him. In particular, he felt the precariousness and unnaturalness of his relations with his wife. When the softening produced in her by the nearness of death passed, Alexei Alexandrovich began to notice that Anna was afraid of him, felt burdened by him, and could not look him straight in the eye. It was as if there were something she wanted but could not bring herself to say to him, and as if, also anticipating that their relations could not continue, she expected something from him. At the end of February it happened that Anna's newborn daughter, who had also been named Anna, fell ill. Alexei Alexandrovich visited the nursery in the morning and, after giving orders to send for the doctor, went to the ministry. Having finished his work, he returned home towards 4 o'clock. On entering the front hall, he saw a handsome footman in galloons and a bearskin cape, holding a white cloak of American dog. "Who is here?" asked Alexei Alexandrovich. "Princess Elizaveta Fyodorovna Tverskoy," the footman replied, with what seemed to Alexei Alexandrovich like a smile. Throughout that difficult time, Alexei Alexandrovich had noticed that his society acquaintances, especially the women, took a special interest in him and his wife. He had noticed that all his acquaintances had trouble concealing their joy over something, the same joy he had seen in the lawyer's eyes and now in the eyes of the footman. They were all as if delighted, as if they were getting somebody married. When meeting him, they would ask about his wife's health with barely concealed joy. The presence of Princess Tverskoy, both by the memories associated with her and because he generally disliked her, was unpleasant for Alexey Alexandrovich, and he went directly to the nursery. In the first nursery, Seryosha, his chest leaning on the desk and his legs on the chair, was drawing something and merrily talking away. The English governess, who had replaced the French woman during Anna's illness, was sitting by the boy crocheting miniatures and hastily rose and curtsied, giving Seryosha a tug. Alexey Alexandrovich stroked the boy's hair with his hand, answered the governess's question about his wife's health, and asked what the doctor had said about the baby. The doctor said there was nothing dangerous, sir, and prescribed baths. But she's still suffering, said Alexey Alexandrovich, listening to the baby crying in the next room. I think the wet nurse is no good, sir, the governess said resolutely. What makes you think so? He asked, stopping. That's what happened with Countess Paul, sir. The baby was treated, but it turned out that it was simply hungry. The wet nurse had no milk, sir. Alexey Alexandrovich reflected and, after standing there for a few seconds, went through the other door. The little girl lay, her head thrown back, squirming in the wet nurse's arms, and refused either to take the plump breast offered to her or to be silent, despite the double shushing of the wet nurse and the nanny leaning over her. Still no better? Said Alexey Alexandrovich. She's very restless, the nanny answered in a whisper. Miss Edwards says the wet nurse may have no milk, he said. I've been thinking so myself, Alexey Alexandrovich. Then why didn't you say so? Who was I to say it to? Anna Arkadyevna's still unwell, the nanny said, displeased. The nanny was an old household servant. And in these simple words of hers Alexey Alexandrovich seemed to hear a hint at his situation. The baby cried still louder, ran out of breath and choked. The nanny waved her hand, went over to her, took her from the wet nurse's arms and began rocking her as she walked. We must ask the doctor to examine the wet nurse, said Alexey Alexandrovich. The healthy-looking, well-dressed wet nurse, afraid that she might be dismissed, muttered something under her breath and, hiding away her big breast, smiled contemptuously at any doubt of her milkiness. In that smile Alexey Alexandrovich also detected mockery of his situation. Poor baby, said the nanny, hushing the baby and continuing to walk. Alexey Alexandrovich sat down on a chair and with a suffering, downcast face watched the nanny pacing back and forth. When the baby, finally quieted, was lowered into the deep crib, and the nanny straightened the pillow and backed away, Alexey Alexandrovich got up and, walking with difficulty on tiptoe, went over to look. For a minute he stood silently with the same downcast face, but suddenly a smile, moving the hair and skin of his forehead, showed on his face, and he left the room just as quietly. In the dining room he rang and told the servant who came to send for the doctor again. He was vexed with his wife for not taking care of this lovely baby, and he did not want to go to her in this irritated mood, nor did he want to see Princess Betsy. But his wife might wonder why he did not come to her as usual, and therefore he made an effort and went to her bedroom. Going over the soft carpet to her door, he inadvertently heard a conversation he did not want to hear. If he weren't going away, I would understand your refusal and his as well. But your husband ought to be above that, Betsy was saying. I don't want it, not for my husband's sake but for my own. Don't say it. Anna's agitated voice replied. Yes. But you can't not want to say goodbye to a man who shot himself on account of you. That's why I don't want to. Alexey Alexandrovich stopped with a frightened and guilty expression and was about to go back unnoticed. But, considering that it would be unworthy of him, he turned again and, coughing, went towards the bedroom. The voices fell silent and he went in. Anna, in a grey dressing gown, her short cropped black hair growing again like a thick brush on her round head, was sitting on the couch. As always at the sight of her husband, the animation on her face suddenly vanished. She bowed her head and glanced round uneasily at Betsy. Betsy, dressed after the very latest fashion, in a hat that hovered somewhere over her head like a lampshade over a lamp, and in a dove-gray dress with sharp diagonal stripes going one way on the bodice and the other way on the skirt, was sitting by Anna, holding her flat, tall figure erect and bowing her head. She met Alexey Alexandrovich with a mocking smile. "Ah," she said, as if surprised. "I'm very glad you're home. You don't show yourself anywhere, and I haven't seen you since Anna became ill. I've heard all about your attentiveness." "Yes, you are an amazing husband," she said with a meaningful and benign look, as though conferring an order of magnanimity on him for his behavior towards his wife. Alexey Alexandrovich bowed coldly and, after kissing his wife's hand, asked about her health. "I think I'm better," she said, avoiding his eyes. "But your face seems to have a feverish color," he said, emphasizing the word feverish. "We've talked too much," said Betsy. "I feel it's been egoism on my part, and I'm leaving." She stood up, but Anna, suddenly blushing, quickly seized her hand. "No, stay a moment, please. I must tell you." "No, you." She turned to Alexey Alexandrovich, and the crimson spread over her neck and forehead. "I cannot and do not wish to keep anything concealed from you," she said. Alexey Alexandrovich cracked his fingers and bowed his head. Betsy was saying that Count Vronsky wished to come here and say goodbye before he leaves for Tashkent. She was not looking at her husband and was obviously hurrying to say everything, difficult as it was for her. "I said I could not receive him." "You said, my friend, that it would depend on Alexey Alexandrovich," Betsy corrected her. "But no, I cannot receive him, and there's no point in." She suddenly stopped and glanced questioningly at her husband. He was not looking at her. "In short, I don't want to." Alexey Alexandrovich stirred and was about to take her hand. Her first impulse was to pull her hand away from his moist hand with its big, swollen veins as it sought hers, but with an obvious effort she took it. "I am very grateful for your confidence, but," he said, feeling with embarrassment and vexation that what he could resolve easily and clearly in himself, he could not discuss in front of Princess Tverskoy, who was for him an embodiment of that crude force which was to guide his life in the eyes of the world and which prevented him from giving himself to his feeling of love and forgiveness. He stopped, looking at Princess Tverskoy. "Well, goodbye, my lovely," said Betsy, getting up. She kissed Anna and went out. Alexey Alexandrovich saw her off. "Alexey Alexandrovich, I know you to be a truly magnanimous man," said Betsy, stopping in the small drawing room and pressing his hand once more especially firmly. "I am an outsider, but I love her and respect you so much that I will allow myself this advice. Receive him. Alexey Vronsky is the embodiment of honor, and he's leaving for Tashkent." "Thank you, Princess, for your concern and advice. But my wife will decide for herself the question of whether she can or cannot receive someone." He said this, out of habit, with a dignified raising of eyebrows, and at once reflected that, whatever his words might be, there could be no dignity in his position. And this he saw in the restrained, spiteful and mocking smile with which Betsy looked at him after his phrase. 20. Alexey Alexandrovich bowed to Betsy in the reception room and went back to his wife. She was lying down, but, hearing his footsteps, hastily sat up in her former position and looked at him in fear. He saw that she had been crying. "I am very grateful for your confidence in me." He meekly repeated in Russian the phrase he had spoken in French when Betsy was there, and sat down next to her. When he spoke in Russian and used the intimate form of address, it was irrepressibly annoying to Anna. "And I am very grateful for your decision. I, too, suppose that, since he's leaving, there's no need for Count Vronsky to come here. However, but I've already said it, so why repeat it?" Anna suddenly interrupted him with an annoyance she had no time to restrain. No need, she thought, for a man to come and say goodbye to the woman he loves, for whom he wanted to destroy and did destroy himself, and who cannot live without him. No need at all. She pressed her lips together and lowered her shining eyes to his hands with their swollen veins, which were slowly rubbing each other. "Let's not ever talk about it," she added more calmly. "I've left it for you to decide this question, and I'm very glad to see," Alexey Alexandrovich began, "that my wish coincides with yours," she quickly finished, annoyed that he spoke so slowly, while she knew beforehand everything he was going to say. "Yes," he said, "and Princess Tverskoy meddles quite inappropriately in the most difficult family matters. In particular, I don't believe anything they say about her," Anna said quickly. "I know that she sincerely loves me." Alexey Alexandrovich sighed and fell silent. She played anxiously with the tassels of her dressing gown, glancing at him with that painful feeling of physical revulsion towards him for which she reproached herself and which she could not overcome. She now wished for only one thing: to be rid of his hateful presence. "I've just sent for the doctor," said Alexey Alexandrovitch. "I'm well. What do I need the doctor for?" "No, the little one is crying, and they say the wet nurse doesn't have enough milk." "Then why didn't you let me nurse her when I begged to?" Anyway, Alexey Alexandrovitch understood the meaning of this anyway. "She's a baby, and they'll be the death of her." She rang and ordered the baby to be brought. "I asked to nurse her. They didn't let me, and now I'm being reproached." "I'm not reproaching you." "Yes, you are." "My God, why didn't I die?" And she burst into sobs. "Forgive me, I'm annoyed. I'm not being fair," she said, recovering. "But do go." "No, it cannot remain like this," Alexey Alexandrovitch said resolutely to himself, after leaving his wife. The impossibility of his position in the eyes of the world, and his wife's hatred of him, and generally the power of that crude, mysterious force which, contrary to his inner mood, guided his life, demanding the carrying out of its will and a change in his relations with his wife, had never before been presented to him with such obviousness as now. He saw clearly that his wife and the whole of society demanded something of him, but precisely what, he could not understand. He felt how, in response to it, a spiteful feeling arose in his soul that destroyed his peace and all the worthiness of his deed. He considered that for Anna it would be better to break connections with Vronsky, but if they all regarded it as impossible, he was even prepared to allow these relations again, so long as the children were not disgraced and he was not deprived of them or forced to change his position. Bad as that was, it would still be better than a break-up, which would put her in a hopeless, shameful position and deprive him of everything he loved. But he felt powerless. He knew beforehand that everything was against him and that he would not be allowed to do what now seemed to him so natural and good, but would be forced to do what was bad but seemed to them the proper thing. 21. Betsy had not yet had time to leave the reception room when Stepan Arkadyevich, just come from Yelyzev's, 18, where fresh oysters had been delivered, met her in the doorway. "Ah, Princess, what a happy meeting," he began. "And I was just at your place." "A momentary meeting, because I'm on my way out," said Betsy, smiling and putting on a glove. "Wait, Princess, before you put your glove on, let me kiss your little hand." "I'm grateful for nothing so much as the return of old fashions, such as the kissing of hands." He kissed Betsy's hand. "When shall we see each other?" "You don't deserve it," Betsy replied, smiling. "No, I deserve it very much, because I've become a most serious man. I settle not only my own but other people's family affairs," he said with a meaningful look on his face. "Ah, I'm very glad," Betsy replied, understanding at once that he was talking about Anna. And going back to the reception room, they stood in a corner. "He'll be the death of her," Betsy said in a meaningful whisper. "It's impossible, impossible." "I'm very glad you think so," said Stepan Arkadyevich, shaking his head with a grave and painfully compassionate look on his face. "I've come to Petersburg on account of that." "The whole town is talking about it," she said. "This is an impossible situation. She's wasting away." He doesn't understand that she's one of those women who can't trifle with their feelings. One of two things: he must either take her away, act energetically, or give her a divorce. But this is stifling her. Yes, precisely," Oblonsky said, sighing. "That's why I've come. That is, not essentially for that. I've been made a gentleman of the chamber, so I must show my gratitude. But above all, this has got to be settled." "Well, God help you," said Betsy, having seen Princess Betsy to the front hall and kissed her hand above the glove, where the pulse beats, and having told her a heap of such unseemly drivel that she no longer knew whether to laugh or be angry. Stepan Arkadyevich went to his sister. He found her in tears. Despite the ebulliently merry mood he was in, Stepan Arkadyevich naturally changed at once to the compassionate, poetically agitated tone that suited her mood. He asked about her health and how she had spent the night. "Very, very badly." "And the afternoon, and the morning, and all days past and to come," she said. "I think you're surrendering to dejection. You must shake yourself up, look at life straight on." "I know it's hard, but I've heard that women love people even for their vices," Anna suddenly began, "but I hate him for his virtues. I cannot live with him. You understand, the look of him affects me physically. I get beside myself. I cannot live with him. What am I to do? I was unhappy and thought it was impossible to be more unhappy, but I could not have imagined the terrible state I live in now. Would you believe that, though I know he's a good and excellent man and I'm not worth his fingernail, I hate him even so? I hate him for his magnanimity. And I have nothing left, except— She was about to say death, but Stepan Arkadyevich did not let her finish. You are ill and annoyed, he said. Believe me, you exaggerate terribly. There's nothing so dreadful in it. And Stepan Arkadyevich smiled. No one in Stepan Arkadyevich's place, having to deal with such despair, would have allowed himself to smile. A smile would seem crude, but in his smile there was so much kindness and almost feminine tenderness that it could not be offensive. His quiet words and smiles worked softeningly and soothingly, like almond butter. And Anna soon felt it. No, Steva, she said. I'm lost, worse than lost. I'm not lost yet. I can't say it's all ended. On the contrary, I feel that it hasn't ended. I'm like a tightened string that's about to snap. It hasn't ended. And it will end horribly. Never mind. The string can be gently loosened. There's no situation that has no way out. I've been thinking and thinking. There's only one. Again he understood from her frightened eyes that this one way out, in her opinion, was death. And he did not let her finish. Not at all, he said. Excuse me. You can't see your situation as I can see it. Allow me to tell you frankly my opinion. Again he wearily smiled his almond butter smile. I'll begin from the beginning. You married a man 20 years older than yourself. You married without love or not knowing what love is. That was a mistake, let's assume. A terrible mistake, said Anna. But I repeat, it's an accomplished fact. Then you had, let's say, the misfortune to fall in love with someone other than your husband. That is a misfortune, but it's also an accomplished fact, and your husband has accepted and forgiven it. He paused after each sentence, expecting her to object. But she made no reply. That's so. The question now is, can you go on living with your husband? Do you want that? Does he want it? I don't know. I don't know anything. But you said yourself that you can't stand him. No, I didn't. I take it back. I don't know anything. I don't understand anything. Yes, but excuse me, you can't understand. I feel I'm flying headlong into some abyss, but I mustn't try to save myself. And I can't. Never mind. We'll hold something out and catch you. I understand you. I understand that you can't take it upon yourself to speak your wish, your feeling. There's nothing I wish for, nothing, only that it should all end. But he sees it and knows it. And do you really think it's less burdensome for him than for you? You suffer, he suffers, and what on earth can come of it? Whereas a divorce would resolve everything. Stepan Arkadyevich, not without effort, spoke his main thought and looked at her meaningfully. She made no reply and shook her cropped head negatively. But by the expression on her face, which suddenly shone with its former beauty, he saw that she did not want it only because to her it seemed an impossible happiness. I'm terribly sorry for you both. And how happy I'd be if I could settle it, Stepan Arkadyevich said, now with a bolder smile. No. Don't say anything. If only God grants me to speak as I feel, I'll go to him. Anna looked at him with pensive, shining eyes and said nothing. 22. Stepan Arkadyevich, with that somewhat solemn face with which he usually took the presiding chair in his office, entered Alexey Alexandrovich's study. Alexey Alexandrovich, his hands behind his back, was pacing the room and thinking about the same thing that Stepan Arkadyevich had talked about with his wife. Am I disturbing you? Said Stepan Arkadyevich, who, on seeing his brother-in-law, experienced what was for him an unaccustomed feeling of embarrassment. To hide this embarrassment he produced a cigarette case with a newfangled clasp he had just bought, sniffed the leather and took out a cigarette. No. Is there something you need? Alexey Alexandrovich replied reluctantly. Yes, I need to discuss something with you, said Stepan Arkadyevich, surprised at this unaccustomed feeling of timidity. It was so unexpected and strange a feeling that Stepan Arkadyevich did not believe it was the voice of his conscience, telling him that what he intended to do was bad. Stepan Arkadyevich made an effort and conquered the timidity that had come over him. I hope you believe in my love for my sister and in my sincere attachment and respect for you, he said, blushing. Alexey Alexandrovich stopped and made no reply. But Stepan Arkadyevich was struck by the look of the submissive victim on his face. I wanted to talk with you about my sister and your mutual situation, said Stepan Arkadyevich, still struggling with his unaccustomed shyness. Alexey Alexandrovich smiled sadly, looked at his brother-in-law and, without replying, went over to the desk, took from it the beginning of a letter and handed it to him. I think continually of the same thing. And this is what I've begun to write, supposing that I will say it better in writing and that my presence annoys her, he said, handing him the letter. Stepan Arkadyevich took the letter, looked with perplexed astonishment at the dull eyes gazing fixedly at him, and began to read. I see that my presence is burdensome to you. Painful as it was for me to become convinced of it, I see that it is so and cannot be otherwise. I do not blame you, and God is my witness that, seeing you during your illness, I resolved with all my soul to forget everything that had been between us and start a new life. I do not repent and will never repent of what I have done, but I desired one thing, your good, the good of your soul, and now I see that I have not achieved it. Tell me yourself what will give you true happiness and peace in your soul. I give myself over entirely to your will and your sense of justice. Stepan Arkadyevich handed the letter back and went on looking at his brother-in-law with the same perplexity, not knowing what to say. This silence was so awkward for them both that a painful twitch came to Stepan Arkadyevich's lips as he sat silently, not taking his eyes from Karenina's face. That is what I wanted to tell her, Alexey Alexandrovich said, looking away. Yes, yes, said Stepan Arkadyevich, unable to answer for the tears that choked him. Yes, yes. I understand you, he finally got out. I wish to know what she wants, said Alexey Alexandrovich. I'm afraid she doesn't understand her situation herself. She's no judge, Stepan Arkadyevich said, recovering. She's crushed, precisely crushed by your magnanimity. If she reads this letter, she'll be unable to say anything. She'll only hang her head lower. Yes, but in that case what? How to explain? How to find out her wish? If you will allow me to express my opinion, I think it depends on you to point directly to the measures you find necessary in order to end this situation. So you find that it must be ended? Alexey Alexandrovich interrupted. But how? He added, making an unaccustomed gesture with his hands in front of his eyes. I don't see any possible way out. There's a way out of every situation, Stepan Arkadyevich said, standing up and becoming animated. There was a time when you wanted to break off. If you're now convinced that you can't make each other happy. Happiness can be variously understood. But let's suppose that I agree to everything, that I want nothing. What is the way out of our situation? If you want to know my opinion, Stepan Arkadyevich said, with the same softening, almond-butter smile with which he had spoken to Anna. His kind smile was so convincing that Alexey Alexandrovich, sensing his own weakness and giving into it, was involuntarily prepared to believe what Stepan Arkadyevich would say. She will never say it outright. But there is one possibility. There's one thing she may wish for, Stepan Arkadyevich went on, that is, to end your relations and all memories connected with them. I think that in your situation it's necessary to clarify your new mutual relations. And those relations can be established only with freedom on both sides. Divorce, Alexey Alexandrovich interrupted with repugnance. Yes, I suppose it means divorce. Yes, divorce, Stepan Arkadyevich repeated, blushing. For a couple in such relations as yours, it's the most intelligent way out in all respects. What's to be done if they've discovered that life together is impossible for them? That can always happen. Alexey Alexandrovich sighed deeply and closed his eyes. There's only one consideration here. Does either of them wish to enter into a new marriage? If not, it's very simple, said Stepan Arkadyevich, freeing himself more and more from his embarrassment. Alexey Alexandrovich, pinched with agitation, murmured something to himself and made no reply. Everything that appeared so simple to Stepan Arkadyevich, Alexey Alexandrovich had thought over thousands and thousands of times. And it all seemed to him not only not simple but utterly impossible. Divorce, the details of which he already knew, seemed impossible to him now because his sense of dignity and respect for religion would not permit him to take upon himself an accusation of fictitious adultery, still less to allow his wife, whom he had forgiven and loved, to be exposed and disgraced. Divorce seemed impossible for other, still more important reasons as well. What would happen to his son in case of divorce? To leave him with his mother was impossible. The divorced mother would have her own illegitimate family, in which his position and upbringing as a stepson would in all likelihood be bad. To keep him with himself? He knew that this would be vengeance on his part, and he did not want that. But, apart from that, divorce seemed impossible to Alexey Alexandrovich, above all, because in consenting to a divorce he would be ruining Anna. What Darya Alexandrovna had said in Moscow, that in deciding on a divorce he was thinking only about himself and not thinking that by it he would be ruining her irretrievably, had sunk deeply into his soul. And, combining that with his forgiveness and his attachment to the children, he now understood it in his own way. To his mind, agreeing to a divorce, giving her freedom, meant depriving himself of his last tie to the life of the children he loved, and depriving her of her last support on the path to the good and casting her into perdition. If she were a divorced wife, he knew, she would join with Vronsky, and that liaison would be illegitimate and criminal, because according to church law a woman may not remarry while her husband is alive. She'll join with him, and in a year or two either he will abandon her or she will enter a new liaison, thought Alexey Alexandrovich. And, by agreeing to an illegitimate divorce, I would be to blame for her ruin. He had thought it all over thousands of times and was convinced that the matter of a divorce was not only not very simple, as his brother-in-law said, but was completely impossible. He did not believe a single word Stepan Arkadyevich said. He had 1,000 refutations for every word of it, yet he listened to him, feeling that his words expressed that powerful, crude force which guided his life and to which he had to submit. The only question is, on what conditions would you agree to grant a divorce? She wants nothing, she doesn't dare ask you, she leaves everything to your magnanimity. My God, why this? Thought Alexey Alexandrovich, recalling the details of a divorce in which the husband had taken the blame upon himself, and, with the same gesture as Vronsky, he covered his face with his hands in shame. You're upset, I understand that. But if you think it over, and to him who strikes you on the right cheek, offer the left, and to him who takes your kaftan, give your shirt, thought Alexey Alexandrovich. Yes, he cried in a shrill voice, I'll take the disgrace upon myself, I'll even give up my son, but isn't it better to let things be? However, do as you like. And turning away from his brother-in-law, so that he would not see him, he sat on a chair by the window. He felt grieved. He felt ashamed. But along with grief and shame he experienced joy and tenderness before the loftiness of his humility. Stepan Arkadyevich was moved. He paused. Believe me, Alexey Alexandrovich, she will appreciate your magnanimity, he said. But it looks as if it was the will of God, he added, and, having said it, felt that it was stupid, and barely managed to keep from smiling at his own stupidity. Alexey Alexandrovich wanted to make some reply, but tears stopped him. It is a fatal misfortune and must be recognized as such. I recognize this misfortune as an accomplished fact and am trying to help her and you, said Stepan Arkadyevich. When Stepan Arkadyevich left his brother-in-law's room, he was moved, but that did not prevent him from being pleased at having successfully accomplished the deed, since he was sure that Alexey Alexandrovich would not take back his words. This pleasure was also mixed with a thought that had come to him, that when the deed was done, he would ask his wife and close acquaintances the question, what's the difference between me and the emperor? He makes alliances and no one benefits, I break alliances and 3 people benefit, or, what's the similarity between me and the emperor? When, anyhow, I'll come up with something better, he said to himself with a smile. 23. Vronsky's wound was dangerous, though it had missed the heart. He lay for several days between life and death. When he was able to speak for the first time, his brother's wife, Varya, was the only one in his room. Varya, he said, looking sternly at her, I shot myself accidentally, and please never speak of it and tell everybody the same. Otherwise it's too stupid. Without replying to what he said, Varya leaned over him and looked into his face with a joyful smile. His eyes were clear, not feverish, but their expression was stern. Well, thank God, she said. Does it hurt anywhere? Here a little. He pointed to his chest. Then let me change your bandage. Silently clenching his broad jaws, he gazed at her while she bandaged him. When she finished, he said, I'm not delirious. Please make sure there's no talk of me shooting myself on purpose. But nobody says that. Only, I hope you won't accidentally shoot yourself anymore, she said with a questioning smile. It must be that I won't, though it would be better, and he smiled gloomily. Despite his words and smile, which frightened Varya so much, when the inflammation passed and he began to recover, He felt himself completely free of one part of his grief. By his act he had washed himself, as it were, of the shame and humiliation he had felt previously. He could think calmly now of Alexey Alexandrovich. He recognized all his magnanimity and no longer felt himself humiliated. Besides, he fell back into the old rut of his life. He saw the possibility of looking people in the eye without shame and could live under the guidance of his habits. The one thing he could not tear out of his heart, despite his constant struggle with this feeling, was the regret, reaching the point of despair, at having lost her forever. That now, having redeemed his guilt before her husband, he had to renounce her and never again stand between her with her repentance and her husband, was firmly resolved in his heart. But he could not tear out of his heart the regret at the loss of her love, could not erase from his memory the moments of happiness he had known with her, which he had valued so little then and which now pursued him in all their enchantment. Serpukhov came up with an assignment for him in Tashkent, and Vronsky accepted the offer without the slightest hesitation. But the closer the time of departure came, the harder became the sacrifice he was offering to what he considered his duty. His wound had healed and he was already up and about, making preparations for his departure for Tashkent. To see her once and then burrow in and die, he thought, and, while making his farewell visits, he voiced this thought to Betsy. With this mission Betsy went to Anna and brought him back a negative reply. So much the better, thought Vronsky, on receiving the news. This was a weakness that would have destroyed my last strength. The next day Betsy herself came to him in the morning and announced that she had received positive news through Oblonsky that Alexey Alexandrovich was granting a divorce and that he could therefore see her. Without even bothering to see Betsy to the door, forgetting all his resolutions, not asking when it was possible or where the husband was, Vronsky went at once to the Karenins. He raced up the stairs, seeing nothing and no one, and with quick strides, barely keeping himself from running, entered her room. And without thinking, without noticing whether there was anyone in the room, he embraced her and began covering her face, hands and neck with kisses. Anna had been preparing for this meeting. She had thought of what she was going to tell him, but she did not manage to say any of it. His passion seized her. She wanted to calm him, to calm herself, but it was too late. His feeling communicated itself to her. Her lips trembled so that for a long time she could not say anything. "Yes. You possess me and I am yours," she finally got out, pressing his hand to her breast. "It had to be so," he said. "As long as we live, it must be so. I know it now." "It's true," she said, growing paler and embracing his head. "Still, there's something terrible in it. After all that's happened, it will pass. It will all pass. We'll be so happy. Our love, if it could possibly grow stronger, would grow stronger for having something terrible in it," he said, raising his head and revealing his strong teeth in a smile. And she could not help responding with a smile, not to his words but to his enamored eyes. She took his hand and stroked herself with it on her cold cheeks and cropped hair. "I don't recognize you with this short hair. You're so pretty, like a boy. But how pale you are." "Yes, I'm very weak," she said, smiling, and her lips trembled again. "We'll go to Italy and you'll get better," he said. "Is it really possible that we'll be like husband and wife, alone, a family to ourselves?" she said, peering into his eyes from close up. "I'm only surprised that it could ever have been otherwise. Steva says he consents to everything, but I can't accept his magnanimity," she said, looking pensively past Vronsky's face. "I don't want a divorce, it's all the same to me now. Only I don't know what he'll decide about Seryosha." He simply could not understand how, at this moment of their reunion, she could think about her son, about divorce. Was it not all the same? "Don't talk about it, don't think," he said, turning her hand in his own and trying to draw her attention to himself, but she still would not look at him. "Ah, why didn't I die? It would be better," she said, and tears streamed silently down both her cheeks, but she tried to smile so as not to upset him. To decline a flattering and dangerous assignment to Tashkent would have been, to Vronsky's former way of thinking, disgraceful and impossible. But now he declined it without a moment's reflection and, noticing the disapproval of his act in high places, he at once resigned his commission. A month later Alexey Alexandrovich was left alone in his apartment with his son, and Anna went abroad with Vronsky without obtaining a divorce and resolutely abandoning the idea.